All right, guys. Thank you so much for coming in. Welcome to, on behalf of Apna Hope, uh, I would like to welcome you all, and it gives me great joy to uh, to welcome all of you here this evening. I mean, of course, you don't know who I am. We are one of the organizers. I'm David. I am one of the leaders of Apna Hope. You see all these guys with T-shirts like these. We are one of the organizers, and we are partnering with RatioChristi, represented by Connor Anderson, and Educate for Life by our lovely moderator, Mr. Kevin Conover. So we do expect a full house tonight. Please do not leave gaps in between. Me, please, if you can squeeze in, that'll be great. Um, and then, we also have a full program, so, we expect to start on time. When you came in, you should have received a handout which had a registration sheet. If you could fill out and drop it off in a box, which we'll have for you at the door on the way out, that'd be great. It'll help us to contact you in case we have future events. This is our third debate, and we are very, very excited to have you here with us. So once again, welcome, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce our moderator for the debate today, Mr. Kevin Conover.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much, David. And I just want to say thank you to Apna Hope. Really, they have put a tremendous amount of effort into putting this all together. It takes a lot of work behind the scenes, a lot of planning, a lot of marketing to get the word out. So make sure you give them a hug sometime this evening. Like you said, my name's Kevin Conover. I'm the host of a local radio program here in San Diego. I have the opportunity to interview many experts from all over the world about all kinds of issues, and some of those are controversial issues. I've had the opportunity to interview both Dan Barker and Dr. Andy McIntosh over the past couple of years. And I think what we're trying to get at here, what we can all agree on when we're coming from different perspectives generally, right? Theists, by and large, Christians, and then atheists or agnostics. But there's something that we can agree on. And I actually recently interviewed Dr. Lawrence Kraut, if you're familiar with him. He's a physicist who's an atheist. And in his most recent book, he actually quotes scripture, which I thought, I was thinking to myself, well, this is funny. Well, there's a scripture in this atheist book. But I was talking to him on the radio, and I asked him why he did that. And he said, there's a lot of good stuff in the Bible. And one of the references he quoted in his book is this. Proverbs 14:15, the simple believe anything, but the prudent give thought to their steps. And I think if there's anything we can agree on, it's that we want to give thought to our steps. That's why we're here. We're not here for an emotional persuasion or to be persuaded emotionally. We're here to think through the issues logically and intellectually. And that's really what I've dedicated my personal efforts to, is thinking through the issues logically. And so my hope is that tonight, regardless of which side of the aisle you're on, that you will listen with an open ear and that you will engage with our debaters in civil discussion. I think that's how you get at the truth. In 1 Thessalonians 5:21, it says, test all things, hold fast what is good. And so, regardless, again, of where you're at, I think we can all agree to that. So I don't want to take up more time from our time to hear from our two guests today. So without further ado, I'm going to invite them to come up onto the stage and have a seat here. And if you could come up, Dan Barker and Dr. McIntosh, please welcome them up to the stage. Let me introduce them. You can read along with me if you like in the program, but let me list a little bit of their credentials. Dr. Andy McIntosh is a visiting research professor of thermodynamics at Leeds, the United Kingdom, an adjunct professor at Mississippi State University. He's the author of Genesis for Today. He's also co-authored a number of other books on origins. He's appeared on national television in the UK with programs such as The Big Questions with Nikki Campbell, and has debated against atheism and on the evidence for creation and design with a number of atheists, such as the late Dr. William Provine of Cornell University, Dr. Deutsch in Turin, Poland, and Dr. Glenn Geher of SUNY New Paltz. Not sure if I pronounced all that correctly, but nonetheless. Dan Barker is an atheist activist who served as a Christian preacher and musician for 19 years, but left Christianity in 1984. Barker, along with his wife, Annie Gaylor, is the current co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. He's the co-founder of the Clergy Project and author of several books, including Losing Faith in Faith, From Preacher to Atheist, Life-Driven Purpose, and God, the Most Unpleasant Character in All Fiction. His next book will be Free Will Explained. And so the way the debate is going to be scheduled this evening is they're both going to give introductory statements of 30 minutes each. Then there will be a rebuttal of 10 minutes each. Then there will be an opportunity, there will be discussion questions between Dan and Andy, kind of a just casual talk. And then there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions if you would like. So I encourage you, if there's something that pops up that you hear that you want to ask about, please write it down so that you can then ask questions of them later on in the evening. And then we'll wrap up at the end, and I'll close us out. This evening, Dan Barker is going to start us off with a 30-minute intro. The topic of the debate, by the way, is does atheism make sense of reality? Dan Barker?
Thank you, Kevin. And thank you, Apna Hope. Kevin, I have to say you have been the most gracious radio host of any show I've ever been on. And I've been on a lot, and I can tell you, and I think you know, there's a lot of Christian radio hosts who are not quite that friendly. But you did a very good job, and you listen. You know, that's one thing. Sometimes they don't even listen. And thank you, Johnny, and all of you. Does atheism make sense of reality? My answer, of course, is no. Whoever came up with the wording for tonight's debate seems to misunderstand atheism. Atheism does make perfect sense, but atheism does not make sense of reality. It's never claimed to make sense of anything. What does make sense of reality is science. Also, sometimes philosophy, literature, poetry, and art. But atheism is not a science. Atheism is not an epistemology. It's not a philosophy. It's not a moral system. It's not a methodology. Atheism is not a religion. It has no creed, no clergy, no infallible authorities, no holy book, no liturgies, no rituals, no dogma, no missionaries, unless you consider this the mission field, I suppose. Atheism has no commandments. Atheism is nothing more than the absence of a belief in God. And an absence is not a thing. If the religions of the world were like a list of TV channels that you could scroll through, atheism would not be on that list. Atheism is the off button. It's none of the above. Atheists just turn off that TV and we experience the natural world directly, not through some screen of faith or some lens of faith. There's that old joke that if atheism is a religion, then baldness is a hair color. Or celibacy is a sex position. Does celibacy make sense of reality? What a dumb question. It doesn't even pretend to. It's not what it's about. Theism doesn't make sense of reality either. Theism is just a belief. The Bible says in Hebrews, he who comes to God must believe that he exists. It doesn't say you know, it says you must believe that he exists. Whatever belief is, it's not knowledge. If it were, we wouldn't need the word belief. We would just know. Theology is a subject with no object. So what does it mean to make sense? I guess it means that something logically follows from the premises from what we currently know. But just because something makes sense does not mean it is true. Things can make perfect sense and be wrong. For example, the ether used to make perfect sense. Since light is a wave, scientists reasoned that there must be a medium through which it propagates. But Einstein's experiment proved that the ether does not exist. It made sense, but it was wrong. Today we're left with the word ethereal, which doesn't mean anything real. We also have the word spiritual, which also doesn't mean anything real. It's an idea that doesn't exist in reality. Even if theism did make sense, it doesn't. Theism doesn't make sense, but even if it did, that would not mean it's true. In order to be true, it must be observed and confirmed. That's what science does. Science makes sense of reality, and reality is that which we observe and confirm. Science, for example, observes that evolution is a fact. And this has nothing to do with atheism. Evolution is irrelevant to tonight's debate. Neither atheism nor theism rely on whether evolution is true or false. If anyone thinks they can argue for a creator by attacking evolution, that shows how badly they're missing the point. What if I said, Andy is guilty of a horrible crime? And you ask me, how do I know that? And I say, well, Andy did it because Frank didn't do it. Does that make sense? Just because Frank didn't do it doesn't mean Andy did. What we need is evidence that Andy did it. And that's the same as saying we know God did it because evolution didn't. In both cases, we need evidence for the action, for the claim, not just some argument that may or may not make sense. Millions of good Christians accept the fact of evolution, and it causes no conflict with their faith. If I let go of this pen, what will happen? How do you explain that? Did God grab the pen and pull it down? Or was it just the law of gravity, right? Well, if you believe in God, that natural explanation won't destroy your faith, will it? Neither the law of gravity nor natural selection should interfere with your belief in a creator. Many believers see evolution as the tool that their God used to create life. And besides, who are you to dictate to God how he could not have created life? Wouldn't that make you a God by telling God what he can't do? Challenging evolution because you think it contradicts the Bible is just arguing for a God of the gaps. When the ancients heard the thunder and they saw the lightning in the sky, what did they think? The only way they could make sense of that was by invoking Thor and Zeus. But now that we know something about electricity and the weather, we don't need those gods anymore to fill in those gaps of knowledge. Those gods died when the gaps closed. Today, there's not many places for a God to hide anymore. There's still gaps in our knowledge, and that's what drives science, to try to answer those questions. But to just throw up your hands and say, Thor did it, or God did it, well, that's just laziness, is what that is. Atheism does not make sense of reality, but atheism does make perfect sense. It makes sense not to believe something when you are not convinced of it. Doesn't that make sense? Should we pretend when we're not convinced? Atheism is a lack of belief. It's not a thing, it's an absence. I lack belief in God because there's no coherent definition of a God. Like, what in the world is a spirit? Has anyone ever defined the word spirit in positive terms? I'm also an atheist because there's no good evidence for a God. If there were evidence for a God, we wouldn't be having this debate, would we? We would have the evidence. We wouldn't be talking around in circles of words and philosophies and what ifs. I'm also an atheist because there's no good argument for a God. And there's about a dozen arguments, and we've talked about them forever and ever. Bertrand Russell said that these arguments just boil down to bad grammar. When you scratch beneath the surface, these arguments are just not really sensible. I'm also an atheist because there's no agreement among believers about the nature or the moral principles of this God they believe in. They all fight with each other. They fought wars with each other. They all think they have the truth, but they don't agree, even though Paul told Christians in the first chapter of Romans, let there be no divisions among you. You should all be of one mind. That tells you something right there, doesn't it? And also, I'm an atheist because there's no good reply to the problem of evil. That could be another debate. And most important, I think, there's no need for a God There's no need at all to believe in a God. Hundreds of millions of good people lead happy, moral, charitable, loving, purposeful lives without believing in a God. We think that so-called holy books, like the Bible, are unconvincing, they are unreliable, they are unhistorical, they are unscientific, and they are immoral. I think one of the best ways to become an atheist is to actually read the Bible. Lawrence Krauss has read the Bible. Richard Dawkins has read the Bible and written a lot about it. I read the Bible all the time. I think it's worth reading this. I think that's really what this debate is about. It's not about what makes sense or not. It's not about philosophy or science or natural theology. It's about the Bible, really. If Andy did not believe that all truth and morality stem from the called Word of God, we would not be having this debate. Atheism doesn't make sense of reality, but atheists can make sense of the Bible. We can read it. People ask us to read it, so we read it. In fact, reading the Bible is one reason that many people give for becoming atheists. The Bible says God is good, but if you take off the glasses of faith and just read what the Bible actually says, you will see that that is not true. The God of this book is not good. In fact, the God of this book is what we would call depraved. A lot of Christians believe in depravity. This being in this book is morally depraved. If you are a good person, this book should embarrass you. It should disgust you for what it says. It's obvious that the alpha male God in the Bible reflects the fears, the insecurities, the ignorance, the territorialism, the arrogance of the Israelite macho men who wanted to preserve their property, including their wives and their slaves. The God they invented is an abusive husband who controls his wife, the Israelites, with threats, violence, and fear. Richard Dawkins said in his book, The God Delusion, the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. He's jealous and proud of it. Let's read the Bible itself. He's a jealous and avenging God, the Lord whose name is jealous. Did you know what God's name was? It's jealous. Many biblical passages proclaim he is extremely jealous. Look at these verses. Jealous, jealous, jealousy, hundreds of them through the Bible. His jealousy burns like fire. He is jealous of idols, of all things. He's really angry about idols. God is unjust. I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of parents. That is unjust. That is wrong. Visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children and upon the children's children. That is unjust. Slaughter for the children. Look at all these verses. Infants dashed in pieces. I will give your wives to your neighbors. The handicapped are barred from the tabernacle. Kill all the non-virgins. Kill all the non-believers. God is 7 times unjust. God is unforgiving. He will not forgive your transgressions or your sins. This iniquity will not be forgiven. These are not my words. This is the Bible. God is not willing to forgive. I will not spare you. God is vindictive. I will take vengeance. I will spare no man. I will take revenge. I will pay them back. Many passages show God's vengeance and payback. I will take vengeance, great vengeance of the Lord. God is bloodthirsty. The Lord has a sword. It is sated with blood. I will make my arrows drunk with blood. The pages of the Bible are splattered with hundreds of bloody verses. Drink the blood, flowing blood, blood splattered on the wall, blood that's poured out, sprinkling the blood, dashing the blood, fingers in the blood. This is a gory book. Thumbs and toes in the blood, blood on their hands. God is homicidal. Slay utterly old and young, both maids and little children and women. You have slaughtered them without pity. Whoever sacrifices to any other god shall be utterly destroyed. Put them to death. Kill, destroy, slay. I will tear them apart. God is an ethnic cleanser. You shall drive out all the inhabitants of the land, for I have given you the land to possess. That's ethnic cleansing. Utterly destroy all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant. He clears away many nations. He utterly destroys their cities. Villages are burned with fire. God is a misogynist. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. Do you hear that, women, Christian women? Your husband shall rule over you. When a man sells his daughter as a slave, she shall not go out as the male slaves do. The census in the Bible counts only males. Daughters are more unclean than sons. Women are property in the Bible. Women are unclean. God is homophobic. You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. They shall be put to death. Their blood is upon them. Look what horrible tragedies have been caused by that one horrible verse in the Bible. And you know, this should settle it right here. If the Bible says homosexuality is wrong, then the Bible is wrong, not homosexuality. Those old guys were just homophobic. Why are we taking their advice about our worlds? God is a racist. The Lord your God has chosen you out of all the peoples on the earth to be his people. Do not intermarry with those other people. That's racism. They shall not dwell in your land. Make them slaves. They will be your property. God is infanticidal. Their eyes will not pity the children. Their infants shall be dashed in pieces. Their women with child shall be ripped up. This is the Bible. Don't blame me for this. This is the so-called good book saying these things. Happy shall they be. This is Psalms, in Psalms. Happy shall they be who take your little ones and dash them against the rock. You should be happy to take innocent babies and dash them against the rock. That's what the good book says, because they were bad Babylonians. Kill man, woman, infant, and suckling. He utterly destroyed men, women, and little ones. Slay old and young, both maids and little children. God is genocidal. You must not let anything that breathes remain alive. You shall annihilate them. So they utterly destroyed the men, the women, the little ones of every city, and left none to remain. Smite them. Destroy the peaceful people. Utterly annihilate them. Wipe them out. Consume all the people. Leave none remaining, as the Lord God of Israel commanded. He is filicidal. Abraham was commanded to offer his son as a burnt offering, and Jephthah's daughter was burned alive to fulfill a vow to God, his nameless daughter. Kill your non-believing sons and daughters. Fathers will eat their sons, God said. Mothers will boil their children. This is the Bible. This is the good book that you find in the hotel room, that you have on your coffee table at home. Mothers will boil their children. God is pestilential. I will send wasting famine against them, consuming pestilence and deadly plague. The Lord sent a pestilence upon Israel. Dozens of passages of deadly pestilence, plagues, fever, and wasting, sickness and disease, tumors, wasting illness, famine, and dead bodies that God ordered. Sword, famine, and pestilence, lethal acts of pestilence, evil arrows of famine, consumption, blasting mildew, botch, worms. Plagues wonderful, that's a strange word, isn't it? Plagues wonderful and sore sickness. All of this pestilence from God, God doing that to his people. He's utterly megalomaniacal. I will display my greatness. Now I will be exalted. Now I will lift myself up. Who talks like that? What kind of a person talks like that? Well, I can think of some people in the news. There is no, I didn't name any names. There is no God beside me. I am the great and mighty, awesome God. Acknowledge my might. I will gain glory for myself. Glorious majesty and dominion. I am great and terrible. Worship me on my high throne. Glorious name, excellent greatness, majesty and strength. I am great. The mighty one, the terrible one. That sounds kind of like the great and powerful Oz. Pay no attention to the man. Who talks like that? What's kind of a megalomaniac wants everybody to worship and all the nations to bow down before it. If you and I talk like that, we'd be locked up. I will show you my power. He thunders with the blast of his nostrils. God is sadomasochistic. Look at this. Jeremiah 13. Look at this. Open it and read it. God is claiming credit for rape. Look at this verse. It is for the greatness of your iniquity that your skirts are lifted up and you are violated. You are raped, a lot of translations say. Because you have forgotten me and trusted in lies, I will lift up your skirts over your face. God is a racist. The Lord will afflict with scabs the heads of the daughters of Zion, and the Lord will lay bare their secret parts. That Hebrew word, secret parts, do you know what that means, path? It means vagina. God is a sexual harasser, groping women to put them in their place. That's the imagery. Even if you think it's metaphorical, it's a bad metaphor. It's a bad way to talk about women. The Lord takes pleasure in them that fear him. He added sorrow to my pain. You shall tear off your breasts, God said. God is capriciously malevolent. There's Job right there. And I think this is the most damning verse in the entire Bible. Job chapter 2, verse 3. The Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? Job was a good man. He was blameless. He was perfect. You incited me against him to destroy him for no reason. Read that again. God was incited by the devil to destroy a good man for no reason. That's capricious. That's malevolent. God destroyed the life of this good man, killing his 10 children, confessing that he did it for no reason. God admits that he created evil. I make peace and I create evil. That's the Hebrew word ra, which is evil, like the same word in the book of Genesis. Job said, the terrors of God are arrayed against me. Job knew that it was God who was persecuting him. He destroys the perfect and the wicked. My anger will destroy them, God says. God is a big bully, and this rounds out Richard Dawkins' list. I might horrify them, that they might know that I am the Lord. Horrify? Do you go to church to be horrified? To be like this big bully trying to tell you? He will laugh at the trial of the innocent. Ha, ha, ha. The trial of the innocent. God said, I will laugh at that. I will send pestilence and blood, and they shall know that I am the Lord. I only let you live so that I can show you my power. I will plead against him with pestilence and blood and burning coals. I will scatter the bones, and you will know that I am the Lord. See my desolations. Be still and know that I am God. That word be still means shut up. Say uncle. Stop fighting. I'm the bully. You say uncle. Be still. God is pyromaniacal. The Lord your God is a devouring fire. The fire of God has fallen from heaven. The fire of the Lord burnt among them. The pages of the Bible are scorched with the flame-throwing anger of God. A fire flashing continuously, flame of fire, great fire. Look at these hundreds of verses. Consuming fire, smoke out of his nostrils, fire and brimstone, fiery oven will devour them. Burn their houses, burn their land, God says. Their land shall become burning pitch. A smoke in my nose. It's like he's a dragon or something, always burning fire out of his nose. He even talks about that, and his breath is like sulfur. Cities are burned with fire. Villages are burned. Forests are burned. Burn their houses. Burn their towns. Fire upon the cities. Judgment by fire. The day comes that will burn them up, saith the Lord of hosts. God's most common characteristic is not love. We hear about that a lot. God is love. But in the Bible, it's not. It is anger. For a fire is kindled by my anger and burns to the depths of Sheol. I trampled them in my anger and trod them in my wrath. The Bible contains hundreds of angry passages. Look at all these. Wrath, wrath, fury. I am sore displeased, like an angry dad. Burning anger, fury like fire, indignation, fierce anger, furious anger. Drink the wrath of the Almighty. Pour out my wrath. Weapons of indignation. His wrath was greatly kindled. Anger, more anger, more anger, more anger. They provoked me to anger. He's really got a hair trigger anger, doesn't he? I will pour out my fury, he says, the fierceness of his anger. The Lord is angry forever, the terror of his wrath. My hot anger will be aroused, and on and on and on, to rouse my wrath, the full fury of the Lord. More wrath. His anger is not turned away. A rushing flood on the day of God's wrath. Furious rebuke, fierce indignation. God, the jealous husband, clearly has problems with anger management, if you read this book. He doesn't know how to control himself. God is merciless. I will not pity nor spare. I will not have mercy, but destroy them. The Lord has destroyed without mercy. Show no mercy to them, he said. Your eye shall not pity them. Though they cry to me, I will not listen to them, he said. I will not revoke the punishment. He kept his wrath forever. God is curse hurling. All the curses written in this book will descend on them. The Old Testament begins with a curse, and the last word of the Old Testament is the word curse. Cursed, cursed, cursed. Curses of the covenant, curses of the law of Moses, curses beyond them. God will put all these curses. God's a slave monger. The slave is their property. You can buy slaves, they will become your property. You can make them slaves for life, God says. The Bible's a slave manual. The Ten Commandments even say you shouldn't covet your neighbor's slave. God is, believe it or not, cannibalistic. You shall eat the flesh of your sons, and you shall eat the flesh of your daughters, God said. Well, now there's some gender equality in the Bible right there. I will make your oppressors eat their own flesh. They will be drunk on their own blood. This is not me talking. You shall eat the offspring of your own body. Parents will eat their children, and children will eat their parents. This is in the good book that you guys, you believers, think is such a wonderful manual for life. God is definitely not pro-life. He is aborticidal. Their little ones shall be dashed in pieces, and their pregnant women ripped open. May the Lord cause you to become a curse among your people when he makes your womb to miscarry. No birth, no pregnancy, no conception, God said. If they rear children, I will bereave them of every one. Give them wombs that miscarry and breasts that are dry. Even if they bear children, I will slay their cherished offspring. I know what you're thinking. Doesn't the Bible say God is love? Isn't that what Christians, isn't that what I used to preach? Well, actions speak louder than words. Love in the Bible is nothing that you and I would recognize today. Jesus quoted from the covenant in Deuteronomy 6, which was his marriage vow to his people. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. The Lord your God you shall fear, him you shall serve. Do not follow other gods, because he is a jealous God. The anger of the Lord would be kindled against you, and he would destroy you from the face of the earth. Is that love? That's a jealous, possessive husband who screams at his trembling wife, love me and only me. If you look at another man, I will destroy you. That's not love, that's control. What about Jesus? Isn't the New Testament nicer than the Old? In some ways it is, but Jesus even said, I and the Father are one. The Father is in me, and I am in the Father. He never denounced him. The New Testament is a huge missed opportunity. This would have been a great place for the moral arc to turn. Jesus should have said, I apologize for my father. He was a sexist bully. Instead, he said, whoever has seen me has seen the Father. And his father, as we've just seen from his own words in the Bible, is a mean-spirited, punitive, psychoneurotic narcissist. If this fictional character actually exists, he is not worthy of my admiration, much less my worship. Why does anyone worship this God? If you claim to admire or praise this alpha male deity, you have serious problems with moral judgment. We atheists are not afraid to tell it like it is, to denounce depravity when we see it. It's a good thing that the God of the Bible is fictional. Now, those verses I just went through, more than 1,000, they zipped by really fast. So if you don't want to buy my book, God, the Most Unpleasant Character in All Fiction, which goes into greater detail and much broader context, you can find all those verses for free at this website, unpleasantgod.ffrf.org. A. Milne, author of Winnie the Pooh, said, the Old Testament is responsible for more atheism than any book ever written. We've read the book, we've studied the book, and we became atheists. Isaac Asimov agreed. Properly read, the Bible is the most potent force for atheism ever conceived. Please, please read the Bible. It's a great cure for faith. I haven't even talked about the internal contradictions or the historical and scientific errors in the Bible, but it's clear that when it comes to morality, the Bible is demonstrably depraved. Anyone who presupposes that this nefarious narrative somehow makes sense of reality has a corrupt concept of truth. Now, how does all of this that I just went through, how does it relate to our debate tonight? I bet some of you are asking that. It relates to tonight's debate by me asking a simple question. What makes more sense? That this Bible is the product of an immaterial, supernatural dictator, or that this book is the product of fearful, patriarchal priests and prophets? We do know that human beings make up stories in their own image. We do not know there is a God. And since we don't, it makes more sense not to believe, to be an atheist. Atheism, as I said, has nothing to prove, nothing to demonstrate, although we can say that by some definitions, God definitely does not exist. Atheism doesn't rely on disproof. What we say is God is unproved. You believers have the burden of proof. We don't have the burden of disproof. All we are asking for is evidence. If you raise questions like, How could life evolve from simple to complex if the second law of thermodynamics rules it out? Or how do you explain the fine-tuning of the initial constants? Or the truly fruitless question, can something come from nothing? Sounds like a deep question, doesn't it? Or those questions, they're not evidence, those are just questions. Even if they did make some kind of sense, that's not enough. For decades, for example, many scientists were convinced that neutrinos had to exist. It made sense, but they didn't claim that neutrinos were a fact until after they were observed. And of course, another truly pointless question is, how can you be good without God? How can you have morals? We may as well ask, after looking at that moral monster of Scripture that we just saw in his own words, how can you be good with God? My goodness. How can anyone follow that creature and claim they have some basis for morality in their lives? We secular humanists know that morality does not come from following orders or from obeying fearfully the commandments of a dictator. Morality is simply acting with the intention of minimizing harm. It's a real-world endeavor. It's not a supernatural mystery. After reading through the Bible, it's easy to see that you and I, everyone in this room, is nicer than God. We are smarter than those prophets. We are kinder than Jesus. We don't need a God to have truth, morality, or happiness in our lives, and that makes perfect sense. So that's his power.
Okay, please welcome Dr. Andy McIntosh.
Oh, that's mine? Thank you.
Obviously, I'm not rebutting, so please note that I'm putting the case that atheism does not make sense of reality. I'll come to some of the very forceful statements that you just heard later on. My contention is that
Dr.
rather
McIntosh,
than it being that,
is your
which
mic on?
Oh, yeah. Okay, just to repeat, I'm not answering what's just been said very forcefully, but I will come to that. My contention, of course, in this statement that I'm making now is that atheism does not make sense of reality. I take it in a very straightforward way. Does it work? Is it coherent? And I say flatly, it is totally incoherent. And I'm going to show you why. Dan has been as gracious as he can be, given his position, but I'll come to a rebuttal later. But in his book, you know, it has a hand sort of dangling. That's what he tries to put over in his book, but really it's that. He is rejecting God, and I think you need to realize that. All atheists are rejecting God.
Amen.
Now, atheism does not make sense of reality. I'm going to spend quite a lot of time on the science, then on logic and rationality, then meaning and truth and morality. It doesn't make sense of the science. I have been 30 years odd in the science. Obviously, not all scientists will agree on this. We're well aware that there are many who are trying to do science and do it very well. When it comes to building aeroplanes, we're not particularly disagreeing. But when it comes to origins, we have strong disagreements. And I think we need to realize that there is a lot of evidence which is against the atheist position based on the science. Let's just look at two things. The physics, a universe from nothing. Peter Atkins, whom I actually heard debate on one occasion in Manchester, he made this preposterous statement that the universe can come into existence without intervention. Absolutely preposterous. Stephen Hawking said something very similar in one of his books, in The Grand Design. Because there are laws such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. It is not necessary to invoke God to light the blue touch paper and set the universe going. Frankly, that is absurd. They're both confusing agency with agent. The fact that there are laws, that were mentioned actually in the first presentation, the fact that there are laws doesn't prove anything. Laws are just simply descriptive. They don't give you, for instance, with Frank Whittle, and the jet engine, they don't immediately say there was a Frank Whittle, but they strongly suggest that there is one, because Frank Whittle was the first person to actually make a jet engine, right? We could describe a jet engine to our heart's content with the combustion, which I've been working for the last few decades on. But the laws of physics didn't start to make that engine. You had to have somebody who had the clever idea to do it. G.K. Chesterton said this very wonderful statement. He was a brilliant mind in his day. It is absurd for the evolutionists to complain that it is unthinkable for an admittedly unthinkable God to make everything out of nothing, and then pretend that it is more thinkable that nothing should turn itself into everything. Look, whatever you think about origins, you cannot just simply dismiss design. You have to take account of the evidence of design. It is strong in nature. It's not weak. It's a very strong position. And frankly, what most people are doing is really hiding from the obvious alternative. They may not like the alternative, but the design is definitely there. Let me come to abiogenesis. Abiogenesis is a very, very important issue, because if you can't get started on the so-called evolutionary pathway, how are you going to actually then progress if you can't even get onto the first rung of the supposed evolutionary ladder, which I don't accept? Let me come to one of the major parts in the cell, which of course we could discuss in great length, but I just haven't got time to do everything. But what I will do is comment on DNA, not immediately on the information carrying aspect of it, but on the fact that DNA needs energy. You cannot just simply sort of whip out DNA from a pea soup of chemicals. That's never going to happen, because there are thermodynamic issues. I had an interaction with Professor Dawkins once, and he clearly didn't understand the thermodynamic issues. He, in fact, got pretty tied up in his own thinking. And it still didn't get clarified when we tried to at least have some interaction in The Guardian. But he said that non-isolated systems can easily be built by a lot of energy coming in from outside. Basically, the issue is you've got to have energy into that first, if you're going to call it a pea soup of chemicals, to get abiogenesis going, in order to zip up the DNA, to get the phosphate bonds to work. You cannot just put random energy onto that pea soup and think that the chemicals will come together. That's frankly thermodynamic nonsense. It will not happen. You can have 1 million universes and it still won't happen, because you actually need regulated energy pathways in order to do it. It's called systems engineering. All engineers know about this. And so random energy does not build machines. Now, I've put this in a much more rigorous style in a paper which you can get hold of. Probably Dan has read it and looked it up for himself, because he did refer to the thermodynamics at one point. But information and entropy, is it top down or is it bottom up? It's clearly top down. There's got to be a mind behind the organizational principle. It's basically a demonstration of irreducible complexity. Let me just illustrate very briefly with another example. If you've got if you've got sun shining on a leaf, you well know that there is this wonderful principle of photosynthesis. Carbon dioxide and water with sunlight does produce sugar and oxygen, but it's only because of the machinery there, which is all to do with the chlorophyll and the catalyst that's going on, that you can get this to work. The same thing, by the way, is true of the work that I've done on the bombardier beetle. It's a classic example, again, of irreducible complexity. People have tried to dismiss these arguments, but you cannot do it, because it's not what isn't there that we're saying is showing that there is a design. It's actually totally the other way around. The more we get to know these sophisticated machinery, the more the actual science says there is a designer. If we're going to talk about gaps, it's the evolutionist who's actually on the back foot on that. He's constantly saying, oh yeah, given enough time, we'll find it. They never do. Everything's actually showing, whatever you look at, that there is design. How about this one, which is a wonderful electrostatic motor, which Faraday would have been brilliantly surprised by, perhaps not surprised, but he would certainly been very proud of. And it really shows immediately that there is a sophisticated engineering going on electrically, where you've got a hydrogen gradient, and you've got ADP plus this proton gradient producing ATP. And ATP is absolutely essential for every living thing to exist. It's actually due to ATP that the energy comes into the DNA that I was mentioning earlier. So irreducible complexity is there all the way down, friends. Irreducible complexity means that nothing will work unless the whole system is working. Take one thing out and the whole thing won't work, right? That is a very important argument, and nobody has ever answered it. There has never been an answer to irreducible complexity. There is locomotion, which of course you can see on this wonderful steam train, but there's the same thing going on at the nanoscale. If I just show you briefly this wonderful video, which
masterpieces
you can
of
find for yourself.
microengineering. Kinesins are miniature motorized machines that carry cargo from one part of the cell to another,
which self-assembles
walking along self-assembling highways.
its highway
called
as it goes
microtubules.
along. To suggest that that has come about
Known as
by
the workhorses
evolutionary
of the cell,
pathways is
kinesins
frankly
have 2 feet.
absurd. Mind and irreducible complexity is what we're up against with the nano investigations which are going on, not primarily by me when it comes to molecules, but it certainly puts the evolutionist into a very difficult position, and he knows it, and some people are actually acknowledging it. All life has digital information involved in it, and it's well known that now coming to the information carrying capacity of DNA, that it programs, as you well know, most of you, for the amino acids which build up, sometimes up just a few hundred, but often it's into their tens of thousands to make the proteins which are absolutely essential. Now, I'm surprised at Dan because he's a computer analyst. He knows about computers. He knows about computer codes. Dawkins didn't work in that area, but he made a correct statement once, which was good. He says, what lies at the heart of every living thing is not a fire, warm breath, nor a spark of life. It is information, words, instructions. Think of 1 billion discrete digital characters. If you want to understand life, think about digital technology. He was correct on that. Absolutely correct. But hardware doesn't make software. Never has done. Never will do. Even Windows machines were actually designed, believe it or not, which is probably why I went over to an Apple, but even those are properly designed. But you know, the whole thing needs software. Just like Dan, who's a musician, and he's created a lot of songs, but the musical score is not the music. Computer programs require minds. Music requires composers. Now look, we could go on, but I need to move on to my next point, but I'll just mention one person who's working in this area. And he's not going to necessarily agree totally with my own position, so please, if I quote someone on my side on this argument, it doesn't mean that they're totally agreeing with me on anything. But James Tour is probably one of the 10 most cited people in nanotechnology at Rice University. And you can see his talks on the web. How do you get, this is one of his statements, how do you get DNA without a cell membrane? And how do you get a cell membrane without DNA? How does it all come together? And he invites the evolutionists to say, come and help me. Come and show me the exact chemical pathways about what happened. And nobody can. And it's the elephant in the living room. Not the living room, in the science laboratory. Nobody's prepared to actually come out and say, here guys, this is one of the most massive problems of naturalism. Thomas Nagel is the one who's actually calling out on this issue. And he's a philosopher, but philosophers can do good. And he's an atheist, and he wants atheism to be true, but he knows full well that atheism is not working, and naturalism with it. Life is full of digital machines, which requires a mind to make them. So information is the third fundamental quantity. I could talk to you about the bombardier beetle. I could talk to you about the feather. I could talk to you about metamorphosis, but time won't permit me to go into the great lengths of those matters. But let me come to my second point. Just let me check on time. 16 minutes. It brings no coherency to logic and rationality. Crick said, you, your joys, your sorrows, your memories, and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. What a sad conclusion. When he made one of the most brilliant discoveries. And yet, instead of turning to the obvious that there was a designer in the DNA, he didn't. He made his assumption of atheism, and note it was an assumption. You needn't have gone in that direction. In fact, the actual evidence was pointing in the reverse direction. Way before him, of course, and I'm not quoting him as a modern chemist, but it was a very interesting point that Haldane made. He was a brilliant chemist in his day. If my mental processes are determined solely by the motions of atoms in my brain, I have no reason to suppose that my beliefs are true, and hence I have no reason for supposing my brain to be composed of atoms. You see, you end up with a nonsense. C.S. Lewis, who was not a scientist, but a very clever philosopher, he said, a train of thought loses all rational credentials as soon as it can be shown to be wholly the result of non-rational causes. In other words, if I've eaten something which doesn't agree with me, right, and I start making completely irrational noises, you know that it was due to that horrible stuff that I may have eaten, garlic and stuff, which I don't really like. Okay, but if you know that it's actually due to rationality, you know that it's nothing to do with the physics and the chemistry. And that's why it's so important to appreciate this argument about logic. In his book, Godless, Dan just dismisses these arguments. Instead of engaging, if only he would engage with these points, he would begin to actually at least come onto the playing field, as it were, with not just saying he's neutral, but actually showing that he's neutral, because he claims to be neutral, but he's not. He's actually anti any position which actually shows the opposite to him, because he says it doesn't produce evidence. Actually, there is evidence. Let me show you just in simple ways why rationality is a very important issue. Why is 2 and 3 equal to 5? Well, apart from bases and all the rest of it, which we could go into if we're mathematicians, but assuming base 10, is 2 and 3 equal to 5 even when I'm not thinking of it? It must be. So 2 and 3 equal to 5 is not defined by my brain or anyone else's. Therefore, 2 and 3 equal to 5 is a fact which is beyond matter. But atheism only has matter and energy. So atheism makes no sense of thinking, and that is a huge issue. Rationality makes no sense without a mind behind everything, including our thoughts. Thomas Nagel understands this. Materialist naturalism leads to a reductionist ambitions because it seems unacceptable to deny the reality of all those familiar things that are not at first glance physical. But if no plausible reduction is available, and if denying reality to the mental continues to be unacceptable, that suggests that the original premise of materialist naturalism, which is obviously the position that Dan holds, is false, and not just around the edges. Perhaps the natural order is not exclusively physical. Now, I would have a much greater respect for Dan's position if he would at least engage like Nagel is. Nagel is an honest atheist in the sense that he said, I want atheism to be true, but guys, it's not working in the science, in the area of rationality. I've not yet had the privilege of meeting him. Not saying it's not a privilege to meet Dan, but I don't think Dan has actually come out of his box and engaged with the real issues. He's in a box and he's getting more and more angry in his book that I read. And to be frank, anger's not going to prove anything. He talks about, well, we'll come to the rebuttal in a moment. Evolutionary naturalism, Nagel says, provides an account of our capacities that undermines their reliability and in so doing undermines itself. Alvin Plattinger, by the way, has also written on this subject, and of course Plattinger is a theist. He's at Notre Dame University, and Nagel, when he reviewed his book, had to admit that actually Plattinger's position made sense. Plattinger is certainly right that if one believes it, the theistic conception explains beautifully why science is possible. The fit between the natural order and our minds is produced intentionally by God. He is also right to maintain that naturalism has a much harder time accounting for that fit. Now, that's what I want to engage with atheists. You see, when you consider Einstein, who was not a Christian, but I wouldn't say he was a theist really either, because he was believing in a sort of Spinoza force. But Maxwell certainly was a theist. And yet, those equations are just brilliant as a description of reality. Where did those equations come from? Some of you are engineers, you'll appreciate the strength of which I'm saying this. Everything electromagnetic which we're using today is all based on Maxwell's equations. And also Faraday, who was one of the most brilliant experimentalists, and between the two of them, they basically showed that logic and thinking can be powerful in actually predicting an experiment which they could do, which actually proved that the speed of light which he predicted was exactly what he said, 300,000 meters per second. That's Maxwell. You see, I think it's in logic as well that atheists are hiding from the obvious alternatives. What really is going on, friends, is this. Particles and molecules don't think. It's like a chap chopping the tree branch on which he's sitting from the wrong place. And so although Dan loves to think that he's free, he's not. He's actually doesn't even explain where his mind comes from. And his rationality, which I admire because he is seeking to be rational, but with his rationality, he's undermining the very basis of all rationality. It's no coherence to that. Well, it brings no coherence to truth. I like this cartoon in New Scientist in May. If my work helps just one person feel like a tiny, insignificant speck lost in a cold, uncaring universe, then I'm doing my job. That spills the beans. That's what's going on. Science is never neutral. It's always driven to a certain extent by beliefs. And you cannot say that when it comes to origins, the fierce debate which goes on in origins today shows that there is a lot at stake. What is meaning and truth? Well, this is, of course, in my country, but we have a lot of 50 limits on our roads. And here's a sign which we might like, lane closed because we felt like it. How would you like that? Is truth just the way you feel? No, of course not. Truth must be truth. There must be meaning. How about this? You see, the atheist really is basically saying, keep calm and carry on. Good British, stiff upper lip with the crown at the top. Just to remind you Americans. So is this all the atheist can say? Is this really reality, or is reality more than that? I suggest, obviously, that it is. And when Richard Levantin famously said this, that materialism is an absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door, he was actually making a religious statement. Okay, it was anti-religious, but it was definitely in the religious camp. You cannot be an atheist and neutral. That's what Dan has tried to maintain in his books. Superior being, very silly idea. This is our world, and we are masters of our own destiny. Believe me, I know. It's very easy to laugh, but actually we need to do our level best to lift young people who are gripped by an atheistic mindset which doesn't recognize that they've made massive assumptions because of being indoctrinated by atheistic professors. I have great, my blood boils when I see what's being done in education today, where we're locking down even a debate on this issue, certainly in my country. What is meaning and truth at all? Here's a painting, insightful, compelling, exemplary. In comes the cleaner, upside down. You've lost all sense of values in a culture which has lost its anchor. And atheism has no answer. All it can do is, when you're an atheist artist, produce taxis with holes in, which is what happened in the Tate Gallery in London. And people have just produced bricks and got millions of pounds because art has lost its anchor. It's not just science, but art has as well. Actually, I appreciate Picasso's painting of the crying woman, because there it showed a real sense of distraughtness of a world which has lost its way. This perhaps puts it more horribly and graphically. Francis Bacon once did a painting which is horrific, but he put against it, man now realizes that he is an accident, that he is a completely futile being. Do you not see that if you're an atheist, you're leaving the door wide open for somebody to say, no ultimate meaning, no ultimate justice, I'll just jump off a bridge. I'll just put myself across a railway line. Despite all the cries of Dan in his books, oh, no, you don't need an outside reference point for good. You do. He's totally wrong. And I mean it, Dan. I'm not against you as a person, but your philosophy is totally wrong. The fear of the Lord, the Bible says, gives the beginning of knowledge. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. It brings no coherence, lastly, to morality, right and wrong. Many people have cried out for a sense of what is right and wrong. Here's not a Christian, but Schrödinger, whose equation is absolutely brilliant, if those of us who've studied physics. He said, I'm very astonished that the scientific picture of the real world around me is very deficient. It gives a lot of factual information, puts all of our experience in a magnificently consistent order, and so on and so forth. Then he goes on to say, it knows nothing of beautiful and ugly, good or bad, God and eternity. Science sometimes pretends to answer questions in these domains, but the answers are very often so silly that we incline not to take them seriously. That is honesty. Dan, I don't think your books are dealing with the real issues that people are crying out to be dealt with in our unjust society. I debated William Provine once. The debate's out there if you want to hear it. Sadly, he's died now of cancer. But he said, no life after death, no ultimate foundation for ethics, no ultimate meaning for life, no free will. It's a recipe for utter sadness and a loss of total guidance as to what is good. Nagel again, he said, I want atheism to be true. And I'm made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers. I don't want there to be a God. That's what's going on, friends. It's the refusal. We don't want God in our thinking, the good book says. Jerry Coyne says in one of his interviews on the BBC, that wonderful neutral organisation in my country, they are specially created, he says it strikes the Christian or the religious person at the heart because it says they are, because it strikes them at the idea that they are specially created by God. Evolution says you're not. Evolution says you have no special purpose, and evolution says that their morality doesn't come from God. That's a recipe for chaos. And we all know it's a recipe for chaos. Atheism, I'm not saying that atheists are going into chaotic behavior themselves. Let me make it plain. Atheists are often very good people, and I would probably include Dan in that, but I don't know Dan well enough to be able to comment, and it's not for me to comment on another person's lifestyle. But I am not saying that atheists are not good. Many people misunderstand when I raise this issue. What I'm saying is you haven't got a platform for right and wrong. You also don't actually have a platform for understanding rationality, which is what that first column is doing. It's incoherent. But it's particularly incoherent when it comes to do with right and wrong. I think I have 1 minute left. So let me quote Schaeffer. Francis Schaeffer was probably the most brilliant person in the latter part of the 20th century in terms of philosophy and Christian philosophy. I guess he and C.S. Lewis between them maybe, but C.S. Lewis died a bit earlier in the 1960s. If man is not made in the image of God, nothing then stands in the way of humanity. Nobody can argue against Schaeffer's pouring out his life to rescue young people from the dropout society of his day. He made plain that it's the loss of identity and the loss of humanity that goes with it. Not only do you lose God, when of course you say there is no God, you lose the definition of what it is to be human. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Okay, so far, a very lively debate. I hope you've been challenged. And, there are tables out front that, give you an opportunity to explore these issues further. Hopefully this isn't the end of your exploration of these issues. If you're here, you wanted to hear both sides of these issues, and I encourage you to dig deeper. Both Dan and Dr. McIntosh have tables out front where you can get their resources. Apna Hope also has resources. You can also visit truthandscience.org.
Truth and Science.
Truthandscience.org. That's Dr. McIntosh's website. He's also speaking at Costa Mesa tomorrow at 7 p.m. He's going to go into why evolution is false. And he's also going to be speaking on Thursday at the Creation Museum at 6:30 out in Santee. If you're interested in hearing him speak further on these issues, you can go out to the Creation Museum in Santee. apnahope.org/resources is another place to get more information. They are selling resources out on the table that you can purchase. They're also giving away Bibles. If you would like to get a Bible out there, they're not charging for the Bibles. And I also have a ministry, Educate for Life. It's 40 online classes defending the truth of the Bible. A lot of the issues that Dan brought up, I actually talk about in my classes. The arguments he's putting against Scripture and the scriptures that he's putting up that supposedly support things like slavery and so forth. RatioChristi is also out there. RatioChristi is on all the college campuses. They're a fantastic ministry that you can look more into also if you would like to. And then Dan Barker's website, ffrf.org, freedomfromreligionfoundation.org. You can also go to his website and look deeper into the issues he has. He has a lot of books, as you're aware of. Okay, we're moving on now into the rebuttal stage. It's going to be a 10-minute rebuttal from each of our debaters. Yep. And we're going to start with Dan Barker. Please welcome Dan Barker up to the podium.
10 minutes is short, isn't it?
Oh, you do what you can.
So it turns out Andy did as I kind of predicted he would do, raise a lot of questions and offer zero evidence. Zero evidence. What he did was he raised questions. Who caused the thunder? Thor did it. Sure, there's a lot of questions, and I made a big point of saying during my debate, atheism doesn't try to make sense of reality. That's what science tries to do. But you heard Andy use a lot of words like, it's just absurd, or it's just very sad, or he doesn't want there to be God, using a lot of emotional types of terms. I don't care either way. If there's a God, I will embrace it. I don't not want there to be a God. What a straw man. What a way to paint atheists. If there's a God, I will go up to this being and I would talk to it. That would be an interesting thing to know. Atheism is the absence of a belief in that God. It's not a rejection. I guess there's a small subset of atheists who would be like, no, I don't want to believe because I want to be free to sin. Yeah, I want to sin with it. What a caricature. That's how I used to preach. Atheists don't want any moral restraints in their life. But many of Andy's arguments and many of the arguments from these creationists are kind of like the guy who's really amazed. How did they get all those rivers to flow right along the state borders? How did they do that? It must have been a massive feat of engineering. What a big social expense in order to get those rivers to go right along the border, and they stick with it. How do you explain that without a designer?
Foolish.
So
Foolish.
that's the argument that Andy is using tonight. A God of the gaps arguments.
I'll answer that one.
Oh.
Sorry, but I've heard him say that so many times.
Well, it's a good line.
It's a bad line.
And it's got it backwards.
It's a bad line.
So Andy
Very
sees,
bad line.
Dr.
Andy
McIntosh.
sees what he thinks is evidence of design. He sees that. Look at this. Look at how did that happen? When in fact, through natural selection and through science, we can see that it's upside down thinking. So here's a good way to just throw cold water on this whole thing, all right? Think about it. The human brain, right? It's complex, and it functions, and it does math like 2 + 3 = 5, and it has rationality to it. Wow, look what our brains are doing, and it feels conscious, and it's like Francis Crick was talking about the amazing hypothesis. So this brain of ours obviously looks like it's functional, doesn't it? It's not a simple blob. It's a complex functioning machine, even better than a computer, right? Our brains are pretty amazing things. Therefore, according to Andy, it had to have a designer, because otherwise, how did it come into existence out of just nothing, right? That's the argument. Isn't that what he said? So now, follow this. This designer also has a mind. This God, this being, this creature up there who's designing. If there's anything we do know, it's that the mind of the designer is more complex than the thing that is designing, in most cases. Sometimes there are exceptions to that. And design doesn't have to be intelligent. We see design in nature all the time that's not intelligent, like the crystals that just automatically grow, which, in spite of the laws of thermodynamics. But if there's a God, okay, and he designed our brains, he designed everything, he designed the brains of the designers of the airplanes, is his mind just a blob, or is his mind beautiful and functional and complex? Is the mind of the designer a beautifully functioning thing? Is it something to admire? Is it just random and chaotic, or is it something that's well-oiled and amazing, right? If it is true that functional complexity requires a designer, which is what Andy is saying, if that is true, then the functional complexity of the mind of the designer also requires a designer. It's called begging the question. It's a circular argument. If Andy says, or any of you believers say, well, God's different, God's exempt because God's the creator. He has this wonderful functioning mind, which is better and bigger than ours because he designed us, but he doesn't need a designer. Well, see, that's bringing your conclusion into your argument. It's called circular reasoning. It's begging the question. If you and I need a designer, then so does God, by logic. If God doesn't need a designer, then the logic is faulty. We may as well not use that logic. And by the way, be careful when you hear the word information. Information can be so easily equivocated because information can be deliberate, intelligent, communicated between one mind and another, like I'm trying to do tonight, hopefully successfully. But information can also be used in a non-intelligent, non-designing way, as like a report. For example, the hurricanes that blew across Florida and Texas and Puerto Rico, they could produce, the weather people could produce a long printout of all the history of it, and the air pressure and the wind speed and the precipitation and so on. You could produce this long paper of information. But is that intelligent information? That's just information of a history that happened. The DNA molecule is very much like that. The DNA molecule, the information in there is not like somebody saying, I got something to tell you. It's more like it's the recording of a history. By natural selection, that which made it was what we read in the molecule, and that which didn't is that which got weeded out. So be careful when you hear that. 2 plus 3 equals 5, that is a proposition. 2 plus 3 equals 5. Any mathematical proposition exists only within a functioning mind. 2 plus 3 equals 5 doesn't exist in the cosmos. It only exists if a being or a robot or a machine or a brain was able to analyze and make an analytical proposition. Then we would say, yeah, I agree with you that 2 plus 3 equals 5. It's not something that exists outside of the mind. It's not something out there. And there's a kind of category mistake. It's kind of a basic philosophy 101 mistake that a lot of creationists make when they think that if you have a word for something, that must mean that it is something above and beyond itself. If you have reason, well, reason must be something above and beyond our brains, when actually reason is just a description of how our brains actually function. It'd be like saying, if you think reason is something that needs to be explained outside of itself, reason is a function of a mind, which is a part of a brain, a physical brain. Look at another, I'm not making a direct comparison here, so be careful, but another bodily organ is the stomach. What does the stomach do? Digestion. The stomach does digestion. So when I use the word digestion, does that mean there's some big capital D digestion in the cosmos out there somewhere? What happens to digestion when the stomach disappears? Right? It's not a thing. It's a description of a process. Reason is not a thing. And I think a lot of believers, like I used to be, imagine if you have a word, think of a word like forgiveness or love, or you think you have these words of labels of processes, and you imagine that they are things that exist somehow out there. And voila, by magic, a transcendent realm comes into being outside of our brains. Look at that. When actually we don't need that. We can say that when the brain dies, so does the reasoning. There is no ultimate meaning to life, and that's good. We shouldn't want there to be an ultimate meaning in life. A lot of what Andy says was playing on emotions. What do you want? Do you want to feel meaningful? Do you want to feel purposeful? Do you want to have love? Do you want to have, if you're an atheist, you don't get these things. Well, it is true that there is no ultimate purpose of life, but it doesn't mean there's no immediate purpose in life. I wrote a whole book about it in which I do engage the issues, Andy, in much detail on many of these things. I haven't written a science book, obviously. I'm writing more philosophy. But we atheists think the fact that there is no ultimate purpose of life is good, because then it's not a top-down command, it's a bottom-up. There is purpose in our lives immediately, not ultimately. So what if it's not ultimate? Why does it have to be ultimate to be meaningful? Meaning and purpose come from living our daily lives, solving daily problems that we have that we overcome now, in our lives now. When we die, it'll all be done. And I think it takes more courage to admit that fact, instead of squirming and saying, oh, it's absurd and I feel unimportant if I don't have a God to tell me what to do. I think atheists basically have a lot more bravery in facing, even if it's true that the universe is stark and cold and empty. Andy is accusing us of there not wanting to be a God, but it sounds like much of the overtones of his talking is that he desperately does want there to be a God, because he wants his life to have meaning and purpose. He wants to be important. He wants to feel like it's something meaningful to him when it's not. Ultimately, you'll be dead, and 1 billion years from now, no one's going to care what you thought or had for breakfast, or me or not. That's fine with me. In fact, that gives my life more meaning.
Well, I'm dead.
Because I'm almost out of time. It gives my life more meaning because don't we give more value to things that are rare? Don't we give more value to things that are precious? If life is eternal, then life is cheap. It lasts forever. But the fact that it's going to end, it's going to be over, that gives it more preciousness, more value, more beauty. And in this world, immediate meaning, not ultimate purpose, but immediate purpose in life. 10 minutes is not enough time to answer. I want to talk about the something comes from nothing, but am I out of time?
We are, you have about 15 seconds.
Well, okay, so let me just say this one sentence. Think about this, if I can do this in 15 seconds. There's a lot more to say, but think about this. If nothing comes from nothing, and if God came from nothing, then God is nothing. Think about it. If it's true that nothing comes from nothing, and God came from nothing, it follows that God is nothing.
Thank you, Dan. And Dr. McIntosh. Dr. McIntosh, 10-minute rebuttal, and Dan, you get to heckle him a few times, just because he heckled you a few times. So.
I'm a nice guy,
Okay,
Kevin, so.
okay.
He's a really nice guy. I want to just refer to something on the computer again, so I brought that up. Yeah, I'll deal with Dan's things that he's just raised just now at the appropriate time. Remember, I'm rebutting what he said in his first statements, although it's tempting for me to do it straight away, as you noticed. If you notice that in his main talk, Dan did not keep on to the question. He very quickly went into a tirade, and that's the only word I can think of, against the Bible. Well, why on earth is he so emotional? He accused me of being emotional just now. If I've never heard somebody so angry against the God of the Bible. Why are you so angry, Dan, against a God who doesn't exist? I have the same argument against Dawkins. If God doesn't exist, well, why don't just get on with your life and just stop writing books and let people get on with it. To my mind, it was a very odd way of approaching the title, because I wasn't even in the title necessarily addressing the Christian God, but it's obvious that I'm a Christian, and I make no bones about that. But I was addressing the question of, does atheism make sense of reality? And contrary to what Dan has just said, actually I was dealing with the scientific evidence. And he was seeking to attack the design position. Very quickly, he mentioned the idea of a God of the gaps, which is total nonsense. There is every discovery that we've seen in the last 20, 30 years, particularly in bioengineering, demonstrates clearly that there is irreducible complexity. I will refer to what Dan's just said, because clearly he doesn't understand irreducible complexity. He has not addressed, both in his books and even just now, what it means to have systems engineering. I'm an engineer, mathematician stroke engineer. I'm involved in designing things. Stuart Burgess, my colleague, and we've just produced a book together. He's a brilliant engineer, much further on than I am. But he makes the point, and in my little bit of engineering work I've done, I know that you've got to get things right by getting a whole set of principles together. The Wright brothers, when they made the aeroplanes, the first ones that they made, they crashed them a few times, obviously, but they had to get a lot of principles right. It was irreducibly complex. You can't have an aeroplane which just has one wing. You've got to have two wings. You've got to have a tailplane. You've got to have a fin. You've got to have a rudder and all the rest of it. You've got to have control surfaces. Frankly, there is just a lack of understanding from the atheist stroke evolutionist camp concerning real engineering science. Some biologists do understand it, but they are few. I've met one or two of them. Most biologists seem today to be locked into an evolutionary mindset which just dismisses any argument from design. The argument from design is very strong indeed, and it's not going away. He said at one point, it makes sense not to believe something where no evidence is. And that seemed totally to go against the all the books which have been written, which he has not engaged, and the philosophers on evidence for God's existence from reason. Now, let me quote from an atheist, who of course is not saying that there is a God, but he recognizes the problem. This is Nagel. It's any evolutionary account of the place of reason presupposes reason's validity and cannot conform it with circularity. Eventually, the attempt to understand oneself in evolutionary naturalistic terms must bottom out in something that is grasped as valid in itself. In other words, what he's saying is, Nagel is writing in very tight language philosophically, but you need to read Thomas Nagel, Dan, and you haven't quoted him. Very interesting that you haven't quoted one of the most, he's certainly very much in the, highlighted today in the debates, and I'm just surprised that you haven't quoted him. Okay, I probably haven't quoted some of your atheistic friends, but he is saying here that you've got to have something which is underneath, otherwise you're going to end up just going around in circular reasoning. If you say that all you've got is matter and energy, and yet you're trying to evolve reason, you end up always with a circular argument. That basically is his point. And it's very important that we do actually engage with these arguments and not just dismiss them. Okay, then he went into his tirade. Now, I'm not going to deal with it all because this has been dealt with by James White in his debate with him, and I would just simply say that he has started in the wrong place. He's tried to define what it is to be human, if you noticed. He was coming out at the end to say, I don't need God to be good. In fact, I wouldn't want to be with that God, he said. But actually, he's got no basis for saying what is good, and he knows it. He's got no reference point. In his tirade against the Bible, he actually is showing why he's going wrong fundamentally, because he's starting with himself, starting with man. Nowhere has he defined what it is to be human. He has said on one occasion in his first talk, well, define who God is. I say to you, that is the issue. You will only begin to define what a human being is by accepting, as God says in the Bible, God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. So if you want to understand both who God is and who a human being is, and what it is to be good, you have to go with a humility before your Maker. In his tirade against the Bible, he hardly was showing humility. How do you define good and bad? He accused the Bible of being depraved. How can you use the word depraved when you haven't even defined what good is? You've got no basis for saying what is good and what is bad. And I might add that there are plenty of people who've been changed, whole nations, by the Bible. And you have the freedom in this country to adopt an atheist view, which is fine, and you have every right to do that. But may I suggest that really the scientific materialism has really grown out of originally what was a Christian mindset in Europe, which freed science from being told by the Pope what was right and wrong based on Aristotle. And that happened 500 years ago. 2 minutes. And now I want to just come to my just closing remark, which I want to just make, which is pertinent to this matter of what Dan was referring to. Stephen Fry is a well-known atheist in my country. You probably heard him on one of his famous statements, which went viral in a similar way to what Dan was saying. You know, if I met God, I'd tell him what for, you know, say how bad he was. But the point I've been making is that there's no way you can define good without God. And we mustn't forget history. Nietzsche said God is dead, famously. But in case you didn't realize it, Nietzsche died. And somebody put on a wall, Nietzsche is dead, God. Now, Dan tried to argue that death doesn't matter. It does matter. Because if you go to a country where people are dying young, if you were to meet my family in 1980, where we just lost a son, if you just said to me, well, don't worry, death is, well, that's it, There was no meaning to that son. If you went to a hospital seeking to comfort ladies and men who are coming in, husbands and wives coming in to see their children dying of cancer, leukemia, I tell you, atheism hasn't got a leg to stand on. Because it doesn't work, friends. You'll never see on a gravestone of a child who died of leukemia a gravestone put there by the parents. I'm an atheist. My child has gone, and I'm proud of it. You can't do it, friends. Atheism is not coherent. It doesn't deal with the reality of a hurting, desperately evil world. Thank you.
I wanted to very quickly just recognize the Chenault family. Is Ross here? Ross Chenault? No? His wife, Mindy, was really the impetus behind these debates getting started a few years back, and she passed away a little over a year ago. She passed away from cancer, and so we just wanted to say thank you and recognize her contribution to these debates. Are you guys having a good time so far? Okay, we're going to be coming up on the discussion time, and you guys will actually get a chance to ask a question. So if you have one, we do have a mic here in the center. Not yet, but coming up. First, we're going to have Dr. McIntosh and Dan discuss 20-minute discussion, just back and forth. They're just going to have a conversation like they're at a coffee shop here. And guys, if you could keep it civil, that'd be great.
Where's the coffee?
That's right. Okay.
Yeah, we need the coffee.
I am a wrestler.
We need the coffee.
So
we need
if
the
I have
coffee.
to get involved, I will. Okay. So, guys, take it away. I'll let you go.
So coffee is actually my religion, so I need it every day or else I have no meaning in life. So you did notice, Andy, that in my opening statement, I was very clear to say that atheism does not make sense of reality. I agreed with that, and I wonder who picked that topic. So having made that, it's not even a concession because I never said that it did in the first place, that science does. Then, of course, I was free then to talk about some of the ways atheists become atheists.
Okay.
And one of those ways is reading the Bible, obviously. And of course, as a former minister, I used to think the Bible was good, and it's not. And in my opening statement, I was very clear to say that there is a basis for good without God, and I stated it clearly. I said secular humanists see morality as the intention to act, acting with the intention of minimizing harm. And harm is the principle. If something is harmful, we call that bad. I define morality, and you've read my books. I define it very clearly. Like you can be more moral without the God because God has a disregard for harm. So I guess I got about 18 questions here for you, but I guess I would ask you.
Ask me.
Is genocide good?
I know where you're going with this. Obviously, genocide in the Bible is described, and there are some times when it was the right thing to do.
Really? Little children, unborn babies, innocent people, all totally wiped out? Why was it right? What horrible thing did they do to deserve that?
Are people innocent?
Well, you don't send a baby to hell for stealing cookies. I mean, you don't kill, there's, justice requires a sentence that fits the crime. And even if they were little bad kids, right? Of course, all societies have them. You and I were bad little kids sometimes. Do we deserve to be annihilated by the sword? Is genocide good? You said it was in some cases then, right?
It has to be in some cases, and there
Really?
are two main examples in the Bible where it's shown that it was justified. God was dealing with a nation in the past, and I don't know whether you've listened to the debate that you did after you did it with James White, but James really did give you answers to these issues.
I listened very carefully to James White.
No, afterwards I meant, because at the time it's sometimes a bit heated, but when you, in the cool of your room, and just listen to James's precise arguments against you, he showed to you that actually you were taking these verses out of the context in which they were written. We could go through all, sorry, I need to come back to your question. But let me come back to your question.
So
two occasions where clearly it was wrong, was right, that God had to deal with whole nations. The Canaanites is one. The other case is the time before, when the whole world, except 8 people, was eradicated.
So babies and little children had to be killed. Butterflies and puppy dogs and God had to kill every single thing because he was not honored. What was the horrible thing that these people did? What did they do to deserve total genocide?
Genesis 6 tells you.
What was it? What did they do?
The imagination of their thoughts, their hearts was only evil continually.
And do you know what the word evil means in the Bible?
Well, you're obviously wanting to tell me something.
In that context, you're talking about context. In the Bible, almost every time God uses the word evil or wicked, it has to do with people not worshiping him, not obeying him, worshiping other idols and not giving him the authority. The word evil and wicked, if you look at it, they were evil. Those Canaanites were evil because they worshipped a different God. That's why
True.
they were evil.
That's right.
Does that merit genocide because somebody has the wrong religion from you?
Just a minute. It also says that God was long-suffering. He didn't do it immediately. He gave people warning after warning after warning.
That they should change religion, right? That was their crime, was
Just
not
a
having
minute.
the wrong religion.
You are starting, Dan, from a point of saying that we judge God.
Yes, we do.
Why?
Because if somebody commits harm, we judge that to be bad. God committed harm, unnecessary, evil, depraved harm on people. Why should I surrender my moral judgment out of loyalty to this abusive husband who tells me I should not look at other, that's kind of like a man telling his wife, if you look at another man, you're going to burn. And that was the evil. Look at the Bible, read it. I'm writing a whole thing about that. The evil and wickedness, with a few exceptions. You will sometimes see it connected to drunkenness maybe, and sometimes to not helping the widows. But evil and wickedness equate to not giving God the glory he deserves.
But just a minute. You said that there is no evidence for God.
Yeah.
I'm answering your question because you're the one asking the questions. But the only way I can answer it is by saying you are starting from the wrong standpoint. You are trying to say that if there is a God, I'm over him. You're trying to make God in your image.
Why not?
Because I'm
Who
saying
makes that rule?
Because if God is God, he clearly must be making us in his image. Who are you to say to God what's right and wrong?
I'm a moral human being who cares about human
How do you
suffering.
define moral?
I just told you. Were you listening to my opening statement?
I
What I
did.
just told you. Morality is acting with the intention of minimizing harm. Harm is material. It's
But
real.
how do you define harm?
Harm is hunger, it's deprivation, it's pain, it can be predators, it can be disease, it can be pestilence. Harm can be a lot of things that we devote our lives to trying to combat. That's what harm is, and if you fight that, if you try to minimize harm, that's what good means. Not obeying orders from a dictator. Even in your own life, you know what harm is, and you know what good is.
But Dan, you know that harm is much less simplistic than you're making out.
There's emotional harm, I agree.
There is harm which goes on from generation to generation to generation.
So the grandchildren should be killed because of the
I'm
grandparents?
not saying that. I'm just saying that there are torturous things involved in our world today, which I won't name situations, but I can think of countries near mine where, because of what happened 300 years ago, it's led to a whole host of misunderstandings, killings, bombings, horrible
so wipe
things.
them all out, all the kids, everybody?
That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that evil is much more entrenched in the mind than you realize. It's not just physical harm that's at stake. It's the final state of a person before a holy God who, contrary to what you're saying, is good, despite all that you put on the screen.
Despite
there.
all that he said.
That's because you are trying to judge him instead of letting him judge you.
I do judge him. I use my moral judgment, and I think he's depraved. How can I not? What if some other religion had a God like that? What if some other, who knows where? You should just, burn all your children with cigarettes and cut their heads off. By the way, this is a loving God. I mean, wouldn't you denounce? Don't you have the moral courage to denounce that Hitler, that demagogue, that tyrant who's trying to bully people with violence and force?
There's one issue you're missing. God dealt with a nation up to AD 70. One nation represented him, right? That was Israel, obviously. AD 70 changed all that. A God now deals with the whole of the Gentile world through the Christian community, which you cannot deny has sprung up right across the world now. And although it may be to a certain extent in decline in the West, I've just been in the East, and wow, it's growing. Now that Christian community is what God is now using to deal with the nations. The fact that in the past he dealt as a theocracy and brought judgment onto other nations using Israel didn't justify Israel. The Canaanite judgment didn't justify Israel. In fact, he says very repeatedly in Deuteronomy, it wasn't because you were good, it was because I was using you to judge the Canaanites. And in the end, they became worse than the Canaanites, so he used other nations to judge them.
But what do you mean worse? What were they doing that was so bad?
Well, do you really want me to describe what was going on?
Because the Israelites were doing the same thing. They were doing child sacrifice.
Exactly.
The Israelites, his chosen
Therefore,
people.
they were judged by a nation coming in saying, you are worshipping Moloch, which was child sacrifice. And do you realize that that's happening today in our nations?
And we
We
should
are
denounce
involved
that.
in child sacrifice with abortion.
And we should denounce any unnecessary harm.
We are going the way of Moloch today.
So let's change subject here.
Yeah, well, that's
unless
an
you want to ask me
embarrassing
some
one,
questions.
isn't it? Well, I'm going to ask you that question in my time so you can prepare for it. What do you do with a nation which today is justifying child sacrifice?
Well, do you know that abortion is not child sacrifice? It is not.
It's a child in the womb.
It's not a child yet.
Audience,
So even
I feel strongly on that one.
well, so do a lot of Christians feel strongly about a woman's right to choose her own reproductive future. Many Catholics and born-again Christians and churchgoers do not see an unborn fetus as a child that's being sacrificed. That's calling them, it's calling these desperate women murderers. And they are not. They are desperate women. Partly because of patriarchy. But
Dan, there's always qualifications, and it's always been in British law until 1967, that when the mother's life was at stake, then, of course, we had to allow it. And certain people make conditions about rape. Well, that may be one which is up for discussion. But essentially, just choosing to abort simply because you didn't want the baby or because it was mentally handicapped is frankly wrong.
I want to tell you that I deal with poor women in Wisconsin. The Women's Medical Fund helps them to pay for abortions. I get some of the phone calls. A woman in Milwaukee with 4 children, and she's 20 years old. Her husband's in prison. She's living with her mother, who's just about to be evicted, and she says, I love my children desperately, and I can't have another child. We pay money for her to get that abortion, which is a good thing for her life and a good thing for her children.
But it's not good for the child.
It's not a child.
You're saying, I assure you, it's a child.
I'm sorry, but you're not that mother, and
guys,
you don't
we
get
have
to make
8
that
minutes
choice.
and 45 seconds left.
Okay,
So
one more question.
What, on him asking me or me asking him?
Does atheism make sense of reality?
But
we're just having a discussion.
Could I just ask?
Yes.
Am I still in the session where he's asking
There's
me?
no,
No,
there's no session.
You can talk.
Back
which
and
case-
forth.
All right, I thought that
Nope.
I thought that it was Dan asking me, and then you would say me ask Dan.
No, but go ahead and ask Dan.
Well, I have some questions to ask you. Well, I've effectively asked the one about abortion.
That's not how he presented this talk. It was just a casual thing, so.
Okay, fine. Frank. I wanted to ask you some questions. Do you think that it's possible to be deluded twice?
Yeah, you can be deluded 100 times. Yeah, it's possible.
Do you think you've been deluded twice?
If I have been, I would love to know that.
Would you be open to reconsidering on the basis of the person of Christ?
No, not on the person of Christ. He does not merit my admiration or respect. I could not. I know too much about Jesus to respect him in any regard. No.
Have you ever known him personally?
I used to believe it. I used to feel it. I used to preach it.
Did you ever know him personally?
I used to say I did. And I believed it. If I was not a true Christian, then neither are you. I felt it. I believed it.
It's not for me to judge that. I'm just asking the question, is it possible that you could be deluded twice?
Exactly. And you could be deluded too. Exactly.
That's true.
So I used to preach, of course, that you shall know them by their fruits. It doesn't matter what someone says. The Bible, you should not judge. You should know, in my life, exhibited the fruits of the Spirit. I had a successful soul-winning ministry. I believed it. I felt it. I loved it. Jesus was my Lord, my Savior. And other people are in the ministry today partly because of me. I was a true believer, and I reject it because I have now learned that not only is it not true, but it's not worthy of my respect. The Christian system is unworthy.
Let me now come to the atheism. Okay, I hear you. Obviously, I don't agree with you, but I hear you. Where is the faith based in your atheistic thinking? You're basically saying that materialism could produce the molecules that I talked about earlier. You haven't answered that at all.
Materialism doesn't produce anything.
So the atheistic materialism, which you believe in, you say produces the machinery of life.
Materialism is just a label for a philosophy about how the world...
Tell me precisely how the enzymes, which are absolutely necessary to build life, because it's not just having the DNA, you've got to have these enzymes which organize all the molecules, organize the DNA. You've got to have the DNA polymerase, which is a protein. Have you worked out how that happened?
I don't know how it happened, and neither do you. It's an open question in science. But by closing an open question in science prematurely by saying God did it or Thor did it is irrational.
No, it's not.
We should stay open.
No, it's not. You're the one who's closed to the obvious alternative, may I say, that there is information, just as we make a computer. I don't make computers, but, you know, Steve Jobs, before he died, brilliantly made these machines, which you're using as well, I noticed, which have a wonderful software, which is an expression of many hours, weeks, years of labor of a whole team of people. You know all this because you were a computer scientist.
Then God is a team of engineers?
What I'm saying is, in answer to your point about who made God, it's totally, it's a very foolish position, if you don't mind me saying, because you are trying to say that all evidence that there could be a higher being has to be placed under my sense of matter, time, and energy. You are closed to the possibility that you've got a God outside time who knows the end from the beginning, who is a brilliant engineer.
Is that a question?
Yeah, but I'm saying, are you closed or not?
No, I'm not.
Sorry,
I am open to that possibility.
Right, well, why not then write that in your book?
Because I'm open to it, but I'm not saying it's true. You would be open to leprechauns and unicorns, even though their probability is low. I'm open to that. I would like to be convinced of it. I'm not sticking my head in the sand like that silly picture you showed up there. I would like to know. I'm a good person. I care. I think. Atheists care, and they grapple with these things. We would like to know, and I'm open to that. But right now, when you use the phrase outside of time, I don't know what that means. That phrase seems incoherent to me. How can something exist you're saying it does, but I would like to know what that means coherently in your proposition before I even start to make an assent, yes or no to it. But I'm open, yes. Are you open to the possibility that the universe is completely godless? Are you open to that possibility?
I would be if the science was not there, but the science is overwhelmingly pointing that there is a mind behind the universe.
As you pointed out, the science is pointing to a lot of questions about how.
No, it's not questions. It's
Where's
just
the
statements.
designer? Let me ask you this question then.
It's not, you've got it round the wrong way.
I think you've got it the wrong way. Let me ask you something. This is a simple question.
3 minutes.
Is the mind of God systematic?
Yes.
It is. You said that a systematic, functioning, engineered thing had to have a designer. The mind of God is systematic and it functions in a complex way. So why does his mind not need a designer according to your own reasoning?
Because you have to allow the possibility that infinity is in a person, not in matter and energy.
Why do I have to allow that?
Well,
I don't have to allow that.
Philosophically, you know that there are two options. Either you have an infinite universe which is constantly remaking itself, which is what many people try to say today in multiverses, or else you say that there is an infinite God who's made a finite universe. You must allow that option, and that's what's pointing. Science is pointing.
I allow that option, but I'm not convinced by it. I'm not closed-minded. I think a lot of believers. I spoke with a woman.
Well, judging from the way you attack the Bible, I don't think you're very.
I attack the Bible on moral grounds. I attack the Bible because I see unnecessary harm by a brutal dictator. Isn't that good? Wouldn't you attack Hitler? Wouldn't you attack Stalin? Wouldn't you say those guys need to be denounced because look how they are acting? You're accusing me of being angry when actually I think it's projection is what it is. Psychologists, if I say something that makes you angry, you project your anger back on me and say, Dan, why are you so angry? When actually I have a good reason for criticizing that God. I read it, I see it, I study it. I don't like it on moral grounds because he's harming, unnecessarily harming people. What's wrong with making a moral judgment?
What about Christ on the cross then?
What about it?
Was that harm?
Well, anytime somebody's being hanged on a tree, that's harming his body. But a lot of people suffered more than Jesus. Jesus had kind of a bad weekend. He died and he came back and went up to heaven again. But a lot of people have suffered much more and done much more for the world than Jesus ever did. He was just one guy with a philosophy and an idea that didn't actually do anything except
1
in
minute.
your mind.
Okay, you mentioned this rivers and state borders illustration. Really, that frankly, you need to take that out of your books because rivers, clearly, you look at the rivers, you look at the state boundaries. I know what you're trying to say, that the rivers came first and the state boundaries, and here comes somebody trying to say that the state boundaries just happened to go down the rivers. Isn't that marvelous? Well, that's just simply an illustration which shows that you are not prepared to actually yourself think that the rivers and state boundaries could have just been, as we all know, just simply the way that things worked out. And we are not denying the science, which is what you're trying to do by that illustration. You're trying to make out that we are denying the science. There is no science for showing that naturally you can make DNA. So if you could actually show that naturally you could make DNA, then I would agree with you that, it's obvious that that's what happened, and it's not for me to then say, well, God's there that did it. You're actually the one who's going against the science.
Time. I'd like to give you an opportunity if you'd like to, or if you'd like to move on to the questions for the
No,
audience.
he needs to answer that because he feels
I'm
strongly
not sure
about
there
that
was a question in there. You were just missing my analogy, basically. But
Well, you were trying to make an analogy that it's obvious that naturally those rivers became the boundaries, right? That's what you're trying to do.
Well, because
Gentlemen, I'm sorry, as the moderator, I'm going to
Very
cut you
good.
off. So what we'd like to do is give an opportunity for students, not students, I have students here from Christian High School. Raise your hand here. Yeah, a lot of students. Okay, so if you'd like to get in line, you can ask a question. What I'd like to do, if that's okay, is alternate. So if you could talk to the people that are in front and behind, ask them if they're asking a question for Dan Barker or for the other.
Hello. I wish to get some more water.
Guys, wait. We're going to ask questions here and we'll wrap up, okay? Whoa, that's a long line.
Martin.
Can I get some more water? Is there any more in the...
Thank you, Kevin.
Sorry, Dr. McIntosh.
No, that's right.
Thank you.
Okay. If you could state your name if you could state your name and then ask your question as precise as possible. As you can see, there's a long line, so we want to give as many people an opportunity as possible.
Dear me.
Please ask one concise question. Do not make a statement, please. Do not make a statement or tell us what you think. Okay? Don't tell us what you think. Ask a question and address it, please, to Mr. Barker or Dr. McIntosh.
For Dr. McIntosh, my name's Peter. And in your presentation, your last slide, you had a quote, and I can't quote the quote, but it basically said, without God, there's inhumanity. Is that roughly correct?
Yeah, it was quoting Schaeffer.
Right, but you used it in your
I was
presentation.
summarizing Schaeffer's
Go ahead and
quote.
ask your question.
So my question is, how do you explain the success of civilizations and societies in China, in Asia, India, South America, all over the world outside of the Judeo-Christian Bible? How do you explain the success of those societies without your God?
Okay, thank you for the question. Go ahead.
I wasn't commenting on the success or otherwise economically or even socially of those nations. They actually do have gods.
Made up gods in their mind.
They have gods. Or else some of them do have the Judeo-Christian God in their thinking. So I was just simply saying that there needs to be a definition of humanity. And in those nations which don't have the Christian God, they actually find that they slide into some pretty awful things.
Do we get to respond, or do we just...
Would you like to?
We can do it like within 60 seconds.
Yes, go ahead.
I'm a member of the American Indian tribe, the Lenape, the Delaware Indians, and my ancestors were on this continent at least, 12 to 15,000 years ago, which was 9,000 years before the world was created, by the way. And we raised families, we sang songs, we loved our kids, we had moral systems, and we got along. We didn't have like these personal gods, we had sort of these nature things. And are you telling me that without God, all of my ancestors were just living these depraved, savage lives?
Well, it's not for me to answer, is it? Because that would be breaking
Let's go.
Go ahead. Next question, please.
For Mr. Barker, my name is Lane, and I just had a question from the atheistic perspective. We live here in San Diego with the San Diego Zoo just a few miles away. We see all these efforts for conservationism with animals going extinct, and generally it's from evolutionists and atheists who are proposing conservationism. How do you make sense of conservation efforts when it's natural selection that is removing, species that, are just too weak to carry on in our modern society?
Well, human beings are a part of natural selection, and for some reason or other, we come, even Thomas Jefferson talked about, even before Darwin, we come prepackaged with some natural instincts of altruism and empathy and caring and concern for others, not just our family, but other species and for our environment. So that's a natural thing. So those animals are dealing with us as part of their natural selection as well. So, by the way, I don't think there's an atheistic perspective. I mean, just like, you try to simplify atheism, like we have this worldview. Atheism is like some book we look up stuff in. Oh, here's our perspective. There is no atheistic perspective. In fact, many believers in God, many churchgoers also care about the planet and want to preserve species as well. So this is not an atheistic question.
Because it's put out in Genesis to take care of creation. So.
Yeah, I have no comment on that.
Go ahead, Dr. McIntosh. No comment?
No.
Okay, next question, please.
My name is Tracy, and my question is for Dr. McIntosh. My question is, who created life, and do people have sex? Sometimes it does not result in a child. And then who created the child in that case of rape, and why is it up for debate about that child, whether it's okay to abort that child or not, depending on who you say creates life? Why is there an exception?
I'm not catching everything you're saying.
Can you summarize the question succinctly?
You said, during your discussion, you said, when you were talking about abortion with Dan Barker, you said that there's instances of the mother's health at risk and cases of rape, and then you said cases of rape that that might be up for discussion. And you were talking about abortion, so I took that as you were saying, in that case, there might be a reason for abortion. So my question is who created life, and why would that life be less valuable than any other life?
My position, and the position of most of the evangelical church right down the centuries, has been that abortion is not right, but that there are exceptional circumstances where sometimes you might say, to save the life of the mother in particular, that's the big one which everybody virtually agrees on, that you would allow that to go ahead. But that if it's rape, personally, I'm not for abortion, even in that case, even though I do respect that there's some dreadful, horrible situations which the lady is caught up in, right? And so I have great respect, and Dan, I agree with actually on this, that we need to show care for such people, and I'm not for, marching against, the sorts of things that have been done against abortion clinics, obviously totally wrong. But I do say that the position of the Christian church has been that it's saving the life of the mother, which may mean that you have to abort.
Well, I just want to say that you then are admitting that this is a question of where we draw the line. You're not drawing your line at 100%, you're drawing it somewhere over here. So others of us draw, and many other believers will draw their line somewhere else. I take exception to your question. You use the word child. A child is a born baby or a viable baby. But most of these abortions, you can take exception. This is a debate. Most of the fetuses are when the fetus is a lot smaller than your little finger, really. And it's a developing human being. It's not a child. To call it a child is importing some kind of emotional impact, like you see the pictures of the babies. And it's not my business or yours to decide for a woman who's in a horrible situation with an unwanted pregnancy. It's not our choice. It's her choice. It's her body. And you even agreed that the line can be drawn sometimes in different places. You said that. So you draw your line there. I'm going to draw my line.
No, that was a different line that we were talking about. It was a pragmatic matter. But the point of principle, we totally disagree on, because you're saying that that child is not a child. I'm saying it is a child.
It's not a child. It's not a.
Well,
it's
that's
not
where
an
we
adult.
disagree.
Okay,
it's
let's
not
go on
an
to the
adult.
next.
It's not a senior citizen.
I don't
it's
think we're
a
going
fetus.
to, this is a whole nother debate, so we're not going to settle that right here at this point in time. So go ahead, next
Hello,
question.
my name is Aaron, and my question is for Mr. Barker. According to what you've told us, if we're here by a series of naturalistic events, and ultimately there is no greater meaning, how do you justify the time and effort that you expend doing this sort of thing? If your own rule would suggest there are better things that you could do with your time that are more personally fulfilling.
Yeah, well, I should say that on a lot of these issues, I don't speak for all atheists. Atheism is not a creed, or there are conservative atheists. We have Republicans in our group, believe it or not, and we have anti-abortionists. We have, it doesn't follow that if you're an atheist, you're necessarily a liberal and everything. So I'm just speaking for myself. But how do you explain a doctor devoting his whole life to eradicating disease? Doesn't he have better things to do?
How do you personally?
Yes, personally, I see religion as a disease in our society, and what's better than to eradicate that, to free people from the dependency on a dictator God, so they're less able to think for themselves to solve real problems and just follow orders, as you see what happened in the Bible. And I think there's goodness in that. And our group fights for the First Amendment, which is freedom of expression, freedom of conscience. What's more important than that? We are spending a lot of time fighting for religious people who often join our lawsuits because they see how good it is for the government to stay out of our personal freedom. So I find immense purpose, and I think this is the funnest job in the world.
Okay, Dr. McIntosh,
Well, I don't necessarily think that it's wrong to separate church and state. So, and there are some areas where actually I would agree with Dan that I must allow freedom for other religions to, even though I disagree with them, to proselytize. But where I think Dan is missing something, he constantly is giving the impression that atheism is neutral. It most certainly is not. It is a philosophy in its own right, and it proselytizes, and as he's quite rightly said, he wants to get rid of religion out of society. That is a destructive...
Out of government.
Well, yes, but government actually does... This is another area for debate. But government does have to reflect some area of principle. And the area of principle has, in the past, in America, been with a Christian ethos. I won't say I agree with you that America was never a Christian country, but there was a sort of ethos, even in Thomas Jefferson, who was certainly not a Christian. And it's certainly in my country, there was an ethos of Christian thinking. Anyway, that's another debate.
The ethos that decimated my Native American ancestors with guns and Bibles, basically. Thank you for that ethos. Right?
Okay, next question.
My question is for Dan Barker.
The next question should be for, I believe, Dr. McIntosh.
Oh, is it?
So
yes.
we'll swap with the next one.
Okay.
You want to...
Okay, anyway.
You need a question to me if you're...
Is there anybody in line who has a
Dr.
question for Dr. McIntosh? I'm sorry, for Dr. McIntosh.
I'll give this question to you.
Okay, go ahead.
Isn't it... yeah, I will refer to his first statement, Dan Barker's first statement. He mentioned about the book of Romans. And I would like to also encourage everyone to read the whole 16 chapters of Romans.
You need to ask a question.
Could you ask a question, please?
My question is, if you believe that what he was saying was like a lie, that God is violent, God is a killer, God is a... Then the premise is God is the one who created us. And then in the book of Romans, he also says
what is the question?
In chapter 11, what would you say about the remnant of Israel that Apostle Paul was talking?
I can't comment on that.
That he will.
Okay.
That's outside our remit on that,
Yeah.
I think.
Okay. This is the final thing. What is he was saying, the logic, that there is no evidence. You are just talking and there's no evidence. What do you think about the air that we breathe and we're all alive here?
Wait, you're talking to Dr. McIntosh?
Yeah.
You're asking him what
is this an evidence? Is this an evidence? Could you expound on this? Is this an evidence that we are alive? And the air? There's no evidence. We don't see it.
Well, I've been maintaining that there is evidence. Dan disagrees with me. But when you actually look carefully scientifically, particularly using my area of thermodynamics, you can see that the machinery of life requires a whole set of things to be right in order for it to work. Irreducible complexity is an argument which no materialist, no atheist, generally it's atheist materialists, although it can sometimes be theistic in some way, but they've never answered irreducible complexity.
I'm sorry,
that is a very important scientific argument.
Yes, they have answered irreducible complexity. I've read many books by Coyne. You mentioned Coyne and others. In fact, there are examples of irreducible complexity where if you take a part out, it still works. They're, like the mousetrap, for example, was the original Discovery Institute's idea. You can build a mousetrap with fewer parts. It doesn't have to, and you can see how evolution works when this function is doing part of this and this function is doing that. They come together and create something new. Scientists have addressed the question of irreducible complexity, although you are correct that there are many unanswered questions, and that's fascinating. That's what drives science. But you are premature to just shut the door and say, nope, God did it. That's my argument. Where's the evidence for you? Where's the evidence for that God doing his thing in the real world? Where's that evidence? Not your questions. So,
okay, we have 15 minutes left. Question for
Thank
Dan
you.
Barker.
Okay. Dan Barker.
Hi, Dan.
Hi.
My name's Nathan. Just to clarify, maybe it's not an inconsistency, but maybe you can explain better. You said that you don't want to reject God if there is such a God, that you don't want there not to be a God, so if there was one, you would embrace him? But then how does that explain, like, being able to embrace such a evil, maniacal, racist, misogynist, sadomasochist? How could you make sense of embracing a God that you find out exists if you believe all those things that you said about the God of the Bible?
Yeah, exactly. I don't think I use the word embrace. I would accept it. If that God does exist, well, then it's a fact, right? I would accept that fact. I might go up to that God and ask for his apology. I might go up to that God and denounce him. I might say, yep, you exist. He's a fictional character. But fictional characters can be criticized. Like, do you think the big bad wolf was a bad character? Yeah, he was. Well, that doesn't mean you think he actually exists. You're criticizing the actions of a character in a fictional book, right?
But I'm not asking about the big bad wolf. I was asking about the situation that...
Same thing. God's the big bad wolf, basically.
Okay, but you... All right.
Okay.
You're avoiding the question. That's fine.
What's the question?
I'm talking about supposing that you encountered the actual true God of the universe that created all things. If you say you're a moral person and you're a good person, and all those things you said about the God of the Bible is true, you should absolutely reject and denounce him if he exists or not. So
exactly.
So I don't think it's fair to say that if I find out that he's true, I'm not really trying to reject him. I think you are rejecting him if you think he's true. If you don't think he's true, then you're not rejecting him.
Okay, thank you. I think he answered the question.
I'd just say that if that God exists, I might accept his existence, but I would not admire or worship him. I'm better than him.
The reason why Dan is saying that is that he's not prepared to accept that he must come to God on God's terms. And God says he is a spirit, and they that worship him must come in spirit and in truth. He knows that he must define, if that's true, his whole thinking on spirit, humanity, by God, not the other way around.
Okay, next question for Dr. McIntosh.
Actually, it's for Barker, but I'll throw it out there anyway. Whichever one you catch it.
Okay, Dr. McIntosh.
My question is this. How many people does it take to complete a genocide?
Okay, Dr. McIntosh, how many people does it take? No.
How many people does it take to commit?
Sir, I'm sorry, we're trying to abide by...
Okay, no.
It's to Dr. McIntosh. Let him answer, and then Dan Barker can pick up.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay.
The situation will depend, obviously, on what's described. We only know the ones that I mentioned are two main ones. The Canaanites, where it was the army of the Israelites, and the flood, which was God actually ordering a catastrophic event in history. And the evidence for it, by the way, is overwhelming.
How many people does it take to commit?
I said it was God in the second case.
Give me a number.
First case, it was an
Just
army.
give me a number off the top of your head.
Do you mean how many people do you have to kill to commit genocide?
How many people does it take to complete a genocide? No.
The question is, it's unclear. The question's unclear.
Okay,
how
here
many,
it is.
How many?
Someone up there said that they agreed with abortion and then talked about the God of the Bible, God being evil because of genocide. Well, there's a woman that every year we have a family reunion. I see her, and one thing that we share when we see one another are two children who was big as a fingertip that we got rid of out of ignorance before the Lord sat down on me. Okay. Now, if there's more than one of you who believe in this, which there's probably actually genocide would mean even you should be thankful because
sir, you have to ask the question.
Okay, so that's my question. My question is how many? And here's the thing. Here's what I'm saying.
This seems like a rhetorical question.
My question is how many?
There's
a reason for it.
Let Dan answer it, because I haven't quite got it.
We're talking about genocide.
I think, we understand.
Okay,
we get it. I think Andy answered it pretty good, that it depends. A genocide, there's no moral difference between a small genocide and a large genocide. Genocide is to completely wipe out that whole population, even if it's a small group, a whole tribe, that would be a genocide, or a whole country, that would be, or a whole planet, like God horribly did with all the people.
I'll cut you off because I can't go into this. Here it is.
Isn't he out of order?
No, because it's time.
He's out of order.
Sir, I'm sorry, you're to ask questions, not to make a statement. We're not debating anything right now. We're letting them answer.
That's what I'm saying. That's why I'm going to let this man go.
Let him just finish.
Okay, go ahead.
But I wasn't finished yet.
Okay.
In the Bible, King Saul was deposed. Read the story about King Saul. You know why he lost his kingship? Because he failed to complete a genocide. God said, kill all the Amalekites, men, women, children, pregnant women, and all the animals. But Saul kept a couple of animals alive. And God said, Saul, you are evil. You didn't obey me. So he found a man after God's own heart named David. David would complete the genocide. He would kill even the animals and everything. And that's why the women said, Saul has killed his thousands, but David has killed his 10,000s.
Sir, I'm sorry, you're just asking questions.
You're interrupting here. But David has killed his 10,000s. So if you want to be a man after God's own heart, you have to be viciously genocidal.
No,
and that's why they have a Star of David today and not a Star of Saul, because Saul kept a couple animals alive.
Okay, let me ask
and
you
you
this
worship
No,
that
sir,
guy?
it's one question.
I
I'm
think
sorry,
you just
that's
have
it.
to leave it there.
That's it. Okay, next question for Dr. McIntosh. Okay, there we go.
Oh my God. So I have so many questions, but I can only ask one. So you say there's so much science that are supporting God. All the science is there. This is all your claims. You're saying all the science indicates a creator. Why is it not in any science book that we open? Why is it not there? You talked about irreducible complexity. Oh, it's under, I have stacks of science books, and you open them up, and it explains the whole process in detail. It's all there.
Okay, we got the
We
question.
understand this stuff. Why is none of this? Why is this not the hand of God right here? This started it all. Why is it not in any science book? And you're a scientist.
Okay,
Explain
go ahead,
me,
Dr.
why
McIntosh.
not one
Okay,
science book?
let him answer the question. Thank you.
Because at the moment in our society in the West, it's dominated by atheistic materialism. Therefore, all the explanations, particularly when it comes down to DNA and everything, say over millions of years these molecules came together, but it never tells you how it did it. And James Tour, whom I quoted in the lecture, or the first part that I gave, clearly is asking people to tell him, how do you actually do this? And nobody can explain it. Everything is indicating, as Dan has tried to refute it, but really he hasn't properly answered it. You get mutated stuff, it's true, which looks like the original thing which was made. You get it with the bacterial flagellum and other stuff. But essentially, all these molecular machines indicate that there is a mind behind everything.
I need to respond quickly because I don't think you even get the question that you asked.
How come it doesn't say that
Because
then? Oh yeah, there's a mind behind this whole process that we understand.
Sir, go ahead, Dan.
We do have molecules. We do have chemicals. We do have atoms. We can see those things. We don't have God. We don't see it. You even said that God is a spirit, and that's what's different about it. But no one has ever defined the word spirit, and you can't define the word spirit.
Because you're starting from the wrong point.
Well, then define the word spirit. How much does it weigh? How much space does it take? How does its spirit differ from nothing
Dan,
at all?
I'll do that only if you define the word human.
A human being is an evolved biological organism. It's a primate. It's part of a homo.
You have not proved that.
I'm defining it. You asked me for a definition, not
True,
a proof.
I did.
So a human being can be defined as part of a certain species.
In which case, God, in your thinking, will always be a product of your mind.
Gods are products of mind. You agree with that. There are a lot of gods that people have made up. I just believe in one less God than you do.
Right? I'm proposing you start differently. You define only human beings by God declaring who he is and then defining who we are.
Why should anybody in the world do that? I mean, that's so upside down.
No,
why not say that about Thor or Vishnu? Why would anybody do that? You would start with the facts. We observe. You're coming at it with a hypothesis, with a belief that you're imposing on top of these facts. The question was very astute. We don't see God in any books because God is not a thing that you can see. You said he's a spirit.
True.
What is that? What is a spirit?
You'll
it's
only
nothing.
find that once you start doing the science properly, which shows to you that there is a designer.
Okay, what is it?
And secondly, when you actually acknowledge that you don't know everything just by looking at matter and energy.
I acknowledge that. Now, what is a spirit?
It's to do with rationality, which you are still trying to say comes from matter and energy, which clearly it doesn't. And I haven't even got to the word spirit.
But what is it?
But if matter and energy cannot produce rationality, and you know that Nagel thinks that,
But I don't agree with Nagel.
Well, I would argue strongly with you that rationality cannot come out of molecules on their own, and that shows to me immediately, even before I get to spirit, that there is something beyond matter and energy.
So what is spirit? Tell me what it is.
I said to you before, you start by saying that there is a God and he may have revealed himself.
But what is it? I'm asking you for a definition, just a simple definition.
And I said to you, your definition, you tried to define human in answer to my question. I'm saying that that definition is patently wrong.
We are not a member of a species?
We are not evolved.
Oh, no.
Well, evolution is a lie.
But at least we are a member of a species, right? We are biological organisms.
We're a species, but you cannot define human because you haven't acknowledged God.
We are biological organisms in a natural environment.
Anyway,
Evolved
we need to get on with the questions.
Okay, next question for Dan Barker.
All right, so my question for Mr. Barker is, why is minimizing harm moral?
Because by nature, we don't like things that harm us. By nature, we instinctively recoil. You put your hand in a fire, you don't think, I wonder, those molecules are being harmed. It's probably a rational choice for me to pull my hand out of that fire. Does anyone do that? We have natural instincts. We protect ourselves from harm as evolved biological organisms, and it comes naturally to avoid things that threaten us and harm us. That's why we build houses. That's why we try to cure disease. That's why we fight predation and why we try to stop war. And harm, by definition, is that which threatens the organism from being able to function properly. So it's kind of a dumb question, because harm by definition and morality by definition is trying to avoid those things that threaten our existence and well-being as animals and as a species. If you don't think that, then you don't have any morality at all. You're just thinking that God's going to tell me. You don't have any way of thinking rationally about how do I weigh the relative merits of these different competing actions of mine and come up with a path that results in the least amount of harm, because most moral decisions are dilemmas, sometimes between two good choices and not just two bad choices. So you have to use your brain to think it through. The harm, whatever harm is, and it could be a million things, but whatever it is, it's material, and its avoidance is a material exercise.
My question would be, where do you get those instincts?
Okay, I'm sorry, only one question.
All right.
Okay, question for Dr. McIntosh. Come on up to the front.
I didn't actually give a rebuttal.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead if you'd like.
Very briefly, I'd say
very briefly.
that harm cannot be defined just by matter and our physical existence. And if you don't have a yardstick which deals with the possibility of justice to come, it can lead to some horrible pragmatic decisions to actually get rid of people because they are harmful to society.
Like Noah's flood and like the Amalekites.
Okay, this is going to be the last question. I apologize to everybody in line, but we're running out of time here. They're going to give us closing statements after this final question. Go ahead.
Can you hear me? Okay. So this is for Dr. McIntosh.
Yep.
Setting aside your sightings of authority, you attempt to demonstrate the design of the cosmos by appealing to God, who is by your definition a designer. And then you claim, since we, or the atheist, does not have a counter explanation to your argument, that your claim of God's design stands as being reasonable to accept and true. My question is, do you believe your argument for design is committing an argument from ignorance fallacy? The fallacy is when one claims that X is true because X has not been proven false. If you are not committing an argument from ignorance fallacy, how would you respond to that point of objection to your argument for design?
That's a pretty long question, and it's taken me
Can you make that more succinct?
Quite a I know
How
where
does
the
your
guy's
argument
going, but
how does your argument for design not commit an argument from ignorance fallacy?
Well, the argument from design is only a pointer, right? It's always danger with any argument that you try to make it conclusive, right? If I was to say that it was based on my lack of knowledge, then I would be committing that fallacy. But if, as I maintain from my engineering discipline of thermodynamics, that the only way to get DNA, it's a pity Dan's not here, but the only way to get DNA is to actually have energy-specific pathways to actually enable it to add phosphate bonds, right? And I know that from my experience.
Sure.
I'm a thermodynamicist. Then I argue that I am not committing that fallacy. In other words, I know full well that people try to argue, as Dan did, that it's a God of the gaps. But he is totally wrong in that when he's dealing with someone who knows their own discipline.
All right, that suffices.
No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. What did you say?
Sorry? I said that suffices.
Oh, that suffices. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question, by the way.
Very good.
I did appreciate it.
Dan is back.
It's a closing statement, isn't it?
Yeah, let's do closing statements.
Oh.
And why don't, Dr. McIntosh, would you like to close us?
No, I'll let Dan go
Okay,
first.
go ahead, Dan. Dan started us off, so go ahead.
Well, I did feel the spirit there for a minute. I had to. A true religious movement, I guess. Where's my notes here? Yeah, there is a river flowing along the state borders.
We'll sort that one out.
You've got 5 minutes.
So there's something very telling here, I think, and I think Andy even knows it. He never defined the word spirit. He used it as integral to his definition of this being that he says we have evidence for, which we don't because we don't have evidence for him. We have evidence for gaps, questions. And he thinks a gap is evidence. He actually thinks that if you can't answer a scientific question, well, then Thor must have caused the thunder. He must have, right? So notice that there was no positive evidence for God. I'm surprised he didn't bring up the resurrection. That would have been a good debate because you hear that a lot. The resurrection of Jesus is supposedly a solid evidence. But and in a debate like this, there's no way we're going to cover even 10% of the issues because it's just so many things and it's just a lot of fun, and I hope we touched on enough of it to kind of show you where some of us atheists are coming from. And as I said before, atheism is not a creed, it's not uniform, we don't all agree with each other. In fact, we welcome the disagreement. It's not like in a church where you all have to think the same. Like Paul said in the first chapter of Romans, let there be no divisions among you. You should all think of one mind. Although he failed to tell us which mind it was that we were supposed to all follow. And every religion in the world thinks they have the right one. Every church says, mine's the true one, but there's something wrong with those others. Even Protestants to Protestants and Protestants to Catholics. And, Paul said in the Bible, God is not the author of confusion. But can you think of a book that's caused more confusion than the Bible? Really? All these different groups, and they all think they have this enlightened view of it. And they can't even define their most basic terms. They can't even define the word spirit. The Bible says God is a spirit. What is that? Without a definition, we don't have any way to even grapple with the probability that this evidence might work. We have to define those words and not just say what they are not, but say what they are. Andy mentioned Jesus hanging on the cross. So, rather than analyze this whole debate, which we can all do later, I would like to tell you what I think the truly good news is of atheism. And it's not the gospel. When I was a minister, I used to preach all over. I used to win souls, and there are people in the ministry today because of my ministry, because I believed it so much. And I still feel that. And I even sometimes get goosebumps thinking about it because it was so meaningful to me to have this God, this friend, this Lord, this Savior in my life that gave me meaning and purpose and joy and all of those things, not realizing that you don't need that. So I thought it was good news, but let me tell you what the good news of the gospel is. I've done this a few times, and maybe Andy's seen this. Suppose you're walking by my house someday, and I come out on my front porch and I say, hey, stop, I've got some good news for you. This is great news. So you stop, and I say, this is wonderful news. You don't have to go down in my basement. And you say, huh? All these months you've been walking by, you've been ignoring me. I love you. I'm important. I'm a special person. And you've been ignoring me, but you don't have to go down in my basement. It made me so mad that you're not giving me the glory and the honor that I deserve, that I built a torture chamber down in my basement. There's knives down there, and there's an oven down there, and there's suffering, and there's an agony of suffering and shame, and there's horrible vats with stinky chemicals. But you don't have to go down there. This is really good news. You don't have to go down there. I sent my son down there, and he suffered horrible because of my anger and my wrath, because you were ignoring me. And now he suffered for you, and now you don't have to go down there. Isn't that great news? Because all you have to do is come up here and give me a hug and tell my son thank you for what he did for you, and then you move in with us, and you can tell me how great I am forever and ever and ever, because I am great. I'm really, really great, believe me. So what would you do? Would you keep walking? Would you say, what a nut? I mean, what would you do if somebody actually said that to you? That's the gospel. This being has such an insecure, fragile ego. He needs to be honored and worshiped. He needs to be told how holy and how great he is. And if you don't, he commits complete genocides because you looked at another man. You looked at another idol. You looked at another religion. How insecure is that? Is that the kind of person you would admire? If it's me walking by that house, I'd say, sorry, I got things to do. I got a life to live. I don't want to spend my life kissing your toes to give my life meaning. I have my own ways to have meaning and joy and beauty in my own life without submitting to the vicissitudes of a dictator.
Time. Thank you.
I just want to show a couple of slides, so I hope you don't mind. We'll just put this back in. In my summary, I've just got 5 minutes, is it? 5 minutes? You'll have noticed that really Dan has not stayed to the issue. I've not actually come primarily seeking to defend Christianity. I am a Christian, but the title was, Does Atheism Make Sense of Reality? And I've shown you from the science that it does not. And despite all his remonstrations and his use of this constantly bad analogy of rivers and state borders, it's actually as though, it's all the science is showing that there is information systems which are going against natural law. So it's a very bad illustration. He really does show that he doesn't understand the arguments from the science. He's also been very emotional against a God that he doesn't believe in. And I think that says a lot. He has every right to be emotional about his own people, because Christians, and sometimes people who claim to be Christians but weren't, made some awful messes. And I don't justify what happened to the American Indians. May I say, though, that amongst them there were really genuine Christians, people like David Brainerd, who died seeking to reach Indians with the same wonderful gospel message. Yes, I do believe in the resurrection, and of course, if we had a debate on that, I would seek to show you that the evidence for the resurrection is strong. But let me just keep to my summary of what we've said tonight. Basically, I've ended up by saying in my last point that you cannot, with atheism, deal with the question of good and bad. If you noticed, he was struggling to deal with the issue of harm. He clearly was struggling because he hadn't understood this. The Bible has an answer to a suffering world. It's not because of a bad God, it's because of men who rebelled. And we have made the world evil. The Bible answer, of course, is that the world was not made like it is now. Because of the goodness of God, he allowed man not to be robots, but to make their own choice. And Adam chose to rebel. I would suggest that Pascal is relevant here. The heart has its reasons, which reason knows nothing of. I believe that it's a heart matter with Dan, and it's shown by the tone of the way he's conducted the debates. He doesn't have an answer to broken people. He doesn't have an answer to when my son died and we stood round his grave. He doesn't have an answer to the leukemia matter that I mentioned earlier. He won't walk through a hospital and say, just trust in atheism. He can't do that. He's got no answer to it. By the way, I'm not saying Dan doesn't have compassion. I can see it in him. Dan, you show a lot of compassion. And I'm not being patronizing saying that. I respect that in you. So please don't take it as a patronizing comment. I meant that as a friend. But you don't have a basis for that, my good person. And atheism cannot change a human heart, whereas the Lord Jesus Christ does. I am now going to mention in the last 2 minutes my own personal testimony. I became a Christian when I admitted that I had done wrong against a holy God. And someone explained to me, not that I needed to have an experience, he explained to me intellectually, I needed to admit that I'd done wrong. I needed to believe that Jesus Christ died for me on the cross and, of course, rose again. And he spoke of the need to personally trust in the God who had done that. Now, friends, I argued that all the evidence is showing that there is both an intellectual God who has made everything. The invisible things of God are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made. Romans 1. But also I've been arguing that God is personal. Atheism cannot deal with what it is to be human. That's why he cannot define properly humanity. And he tries to push the question on me by saying that God is a spirit. He knows full well that humanity is more than matter and energy. He talks about being good. He can't define good because he hasn't taken into account God.
Time. Go ahead, finish.
I'm done.
Thank you very much.
Can I just say, I'm sure Dan has as well, but I don't think I'm breaking a rule here.
No.
That Dan also has literature, but I've got a literature available, The Relevance of Christianity in a Scientific Age. If anybody would like to take this from me, I've written a foreword, but it's by Professor Werner Wright, who died of cancer in 1998. Brilliant rheumatologist, but also Christian.
Could we please thank Apna Hope for putting this debate on? And if we could also say thank you to Dan and Dr. McIntosh also for all their effort in preparing. Thank you very much for coming out. Have a nice evening.